Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Tonight, we're traveling to the heart of the American Midwest, to a place that, at first glance, seems ordinary. Rolling fields stretch for miles beneath pale skies. Wooden barns lean gently in the wind. In winter, the snow lies so thick that the world feels completely silent. From the highway, the lights of small towns flicker faintly, like stars on the horizon. But within that quiet, within the solitude of rural life, stories sometimes unfold that defy all reason. Hidden away behind the closed doors of lonely farmhouses, the world can become stranger, more secretive, and at times deeply unsettling. Tonight, we'll explore one of those stories. This is the true account of Ed Gein, a quiet man who lived alone on a desolate farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin. A man whose life, and the secrets discovered after his arrest, would shock the world and inspire decades of books and films that tried to understand what had happened there. We'll move slowly through his world, through the hardships of 1930s farm life, the strict religious influence of his upbringing, and the deep isolation that marked his adult years. We'll see how the people of Plainfield came to know him, a handyman, a quiet neighbor, a man who kept mostly to himself, and we'll follow the investigation that began with a single disappearance and ended with a discovery that would change American true crime forever. This isn't a story told for shock. It's told to understand, to explore how loneliness, obsession, and untreated illness can twist an ordinary life into something history will never forget. Before we begin, I'd love it if you could take a moment to comment down below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how people from every corner of the world gather here each night to listen, to learn, and to drift into sleep to stories from our shared past. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let the noise of the day fall away. As the room grows still, we'll step back in time, to 1950s Wisconsin, to the quiet town of Plainfield, and to the story of a man whose name became forever linked with America's darkest folklore. This is the entire story of Ed Gein. Chapter 1. The Town of Plainfield. To understand Ed Gein, you first have to understand where he came from. The story begins not in the man himself, but in the land that shaped him. A lonely patch of Wisconsin soil that, in the middle of the 20th century, could feel both peaceful and desolate all at once. Plainfield, Wisconsin, was, and still is, a small town, resting quietly in Waushara County, about halfway between the Fox River Valley and the Wisconsin Dells. In the early 1950s, it was home to just a few hundred people. You could walk from one end of Main Street to the other in a matter of minutes. There was a grocery store, a tavern or two, a few gas pumps, a feed store, and a small post office where nearly everyone in town passed through at some point each week. The people who lived there were mostly farmers, laborers, and small business owners, descendants of settlers who had come north generations earlier to cut timber and clear land for crops. They were practical, close-knit, and hard-working. Most families attended the same churches, sent their children to the same small schoolhouse, and knew each other by name. In summer, the town smelled faintly of earth and diesel, tractors moving slowly along dirt roads, hay stacked high in weathered barns. In winter, the fields froze over, and the whole landscape turned white and silent. The snowdrifts would pile so high that cars sometimes vanished from sight overnight. The wind blew across the plains with nothing to stop it, whistling through the cracks in old farmhouses and rattling tin roofs until morning. It was the kind of place where life moved in predictable rhythms. People rose with the sun, worked until dusk, and spent evenings gathered around radios that brought in voices from distant cities. Milwaukee, Chicago, Minneapolis. Places that felt like other worlds entirely. There was comfort in that isolation. Safety, even. The world outside could change as fast as it wanted to, but here, things stayed the same. The same faces, the same roads, the same routines. Neighbors trusted one another. Doors were left unlocked. But that quiet predictability also came with something else. A deep kind of solitude. Farms stretched far apart, sometimes miles from the nearest neighbor. Winters were long, and travel could be difficult. For people who lived alone, days could pass without another human voice. In that silence, thoughts had room to echo, and sometimes those echoes could grow strange. By the 1940s, Plainfield had already seen better days. The boom of early settlement had faded, and many young people were leaving for bigger cities. Those who stayed behind were the ones tied to the land, people who worked the soil, fixed engines, or ran the small businesses that kept the town going. Main Street was unpaved for many years, turning to mud in spring and dust in summer. There were no streetlights beyond the heart of town. At night, once the last cafe had closed and the final customers left the tavern, the streets went completely dark. Out in the countryside, even the faint glow of town lights vanished. On clear nights, you could see the Milky Way stretch across the sky, so bright it seemed to shimmer. That was the Plainfield Ed Gein knew. A town that seemed simple, almost innocent. A place where everyone believed they understood one another, and where anything beyond the ordinary felt impossible. The people of Plainfield were shaped by their surroundings. The winters taught endurance. The isolation taught self-reliance. Religion ran deep, not just as faith, but as a way of life. On Sundays, families packed into wooden pews beneath tall steeples, and preachers spoke about sin, redemption, and the need to live a pure, moral life. It was a conservative time, in a conservative place. Television had not yet reached most homes. The outside world arrived through newspapers, radio, and word of mouth. News traveled slowly, and gossip traveled fast. Everyone in town knew the names of their neighbors, who was getting married, whose crops had failed, whose child had fallen ill. But beneath that surface familiarity, there were always secrets. Small ones at first, the kind that build up quietly in towns where everyone knows everyone, and everyone, in turn, feels the need to appear respectable. Plainfield's landscape itself seemed to encourage secrecy. The countryside was dotted with bogs and marshes, stretches of thick forest, and long, empty roads that wound between them. There were places where the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground, and others where the open fields stretched so wide that the horizon seemed to swallow the sky. It was beautiful in its own way, but it could also feel eerie, especially in the stillness of night, when the nearest farmhouse light was just a distant flicker through the trees. The Gein family farm lay a few miles outside town, along a gravel road that turned to dirt the farther you went. The property was large, nearly 200 acres, but most of it was wild and uncultivated. The farmhouse itself was 2 stories tall, built in the 1870s, with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. For most locals, it was just another old farmstead. Nothing unusual. But that isolation, that distance from neighbors and community, gave the Gein place a strange aura even before anyone knew what would later be discovered there. Children avoided walking past it after dark. Some claimed they saw shadows moving in the windows. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to change pitch as it passed over the empty fields. Whatever it was, the Gein farm became, even then, a small source of unease in an otherwise ordinary landscape. Yet for the most part, life in Plainfield carried on peacefully. The local general store was the heart of the community. It was where farmers came to buy feed and hardware, and where townsfolk stopped in for conversation. The barber shop served as a kind of informal news station. The local tavern, especially on cold nights, was where men gathered to talk about the weather, hunting, and the price of crops. If you'd asked anyone in the early 1950s to name a dangerous place in Plainfield, they probably would have laughed. The sheriff's office was small and quiet, and serious crimes were rare. Most calls were about stray livestock or disputes over fences. There were no city sirens, no sense of threat. In this way, the town's innocence became part of its identity. People were proud of their safety, proud of their simplicity. They looked at the headlines from Chicago or Milwaukee, stories of gangsters, robberies, corruption, and felt relieved to live in a place untouched by those troubles. That sense of peace is what made what happened later so unthinkable. When the news finally broke, it shattered that illusion completely. But in the years before, Plainfield was the picture of ordinary American life, quiet, modest, and slow. The town's rhythm was marked by the seasons. Spring brought the thaw, and with it the smell of damp earth and growing things. Summer was busy, planting, tending, repairing. Autumn was the harvest, with tractors rolling down the roads piled high with corn and potatoes. And winter, long, cold, and silent, was a time for reflection and survival. Most homes were heated with wood or coal. Families gathered close to stoves at night, listening to the wind outside and the creak of their old houses settling in the frost. There was comfort in that predictability, but for some, there was also restlessness, the quiet that could drive the mind inward. It's no coincidence that the Midwest has given rise to so many eerie legends. There's something about the vastness of it, the endless horizon, the emptiness, that seems to invite mystery. A flicker of light in the woods, a voice carried by the wind, a farmhouse too quiet for too long. In the 1950s, Plainfield was such a place, half pastoral, half haunted by its own silence. And it was here, in this setting of frozen fields and narrow roads, that a solitary man lived out his days, quietly going about his chores, visiting the hardware store and keeping to himself. No one could have guessed, then, that this sleepy little town would soon be thrust into headlines across the world, that its name, Plainfield, would forever be spoken in the same breath as the man who lived on its outskirts. To those who knew him, Ed Gein was simply another local. A bit odd, perhaps, but harmless. Just one of the many faces in a place where everyone seemed ordinary. But the story of Plainfield, and the man who called it home, would soon reveal how fragile that sense of normalcy truly was. And so, as the snow fell across the farmlands and the lights dimmed along Main Street, life in Plainfield continued, unaware that the quiet, lonely figure on the edge of town was about to change everything. Chapter 2. A quiet man on the farm. Long before Ed Gein became a name the world would recognize, he was just a child, small, quiet, and curious, growing up on the edges of a farm that always seemed a little too big for the people who lived there. He was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, on August 27th, 1906, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. At the time, La Crosse was a small but bustling lumber town along the Mississippi River, surrounded by bluffs and farmland. The Gaines' house sat on the outskirts, where the noise of the mills faded into open country. His father, George, was a man of mixed fortune. He had worked in carpentry and tanneries, and for a time ran a small grocery business. But he struggled with ambition and with drink, and over the years, his ventures failed one by one. By the time Ed was a boy, George's life had grown small and quiet, spent mostly in the shadow of his wife, Augusta. Augusta Gein was a force of will. Strong-minded, devout, and unyielding, she ruled the household with a kind of moral certainty that left little room for disagreement. Her beliefs were rooted in a strict interpretation of the Bible. To her, the world outside was filled with corruption and sin, cities, taverns, even neighbors who didn't live according to her rules. She believed that she alone could protect her children from that moral decay, and she built her home around that conviction. From the very beginning, Ed's world was shaped by Augusta's voice. She read scripture to her sons daily, warning them of temptation and weakness. She spoke often about the dangers of immorality, of pride, of desire. For her, the world was a test, one that most people failed, and she made sure her sons understood that lesson deeply. Ed's older brother, Henry, was more independent, more willing to question their mother's teachings. But Ed absorbed them completely. To him, Augusta was not just a mother. She was the ultimate authority, the moral center of the universe. Her approval meant everything, and her disapproval could silence him for days. The family's isolation deepened over time. In 1914, when Ed was about 8, the Geins moved away from La Crosse to a 155-acre farm just outside the town of Plainfield. Augusta wanted to remove her family from the influence of what she called wickedness. She chose a place miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by fields, woods, and marshland. For Ed, that move marked the beginning of a childhood lived almost entirely apart from the world. The farmhouse was old but sturdy, filled with the smell of wood smoke and kerosene. It had no electricity, no running water. The family lived simply, raising crops, tending livestock, and working from sunrise to sunset. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with silence. Augusta allowed little laughter, no games, no visitors. The boys attended a small local school for a few years, but she made sure their social lives went no further than the classroom. When they returned home, she isolated them again, teaching lessons from the Bible and warning them that most people were destined for ruin. Still, Ed was known as a polite and soft-spoken child. Teachers described him as shy but well-behaved. He did his chores without complaint and rarely raised his voice. Other children noticed something unusual about him, a distant quality, as if his mind was always somewhere else. But they didn't tease him much. In a town that valued hard work and obedience, Ed's quietness didn't stand out. He struggled with eye contact, avoided large groups, and sometimes smiled at moments when others didn't. Today, many might recognize signs of deep social anxiety or developmental differences, but at the time, those were not things people spoke about. In Plainfield, you were either normal or you weren't, and Ed, to most, was just different. The Gein boy's father, George, grew more withdrawn as the years passed. He found comfort in drink, and Augusta's disappointment in him was constant. She saw his weakness as moral failure and often berated him in front of their sons. The household became a place of quiet tension. Augusta's authority absolute, George's spirit fading, and the boys caught in between. When Ed wasn't working the farm or listening to his mother's teachings, he escaped into books and magazines. He loved adventure stories, tales of the frontier, and later, pulp magazines that blended fact and fiction. They offered worlds far beyond the confines of his home, places filled with color, danger, and mystery, the very things his mother tried to keep from him. Despite her harshness, Ed adored Augusta. He saw her strength as divine. To him, she was the one good person in a world filled with corruption. Every word she spoke became a kind of truth. That devotion would define him long after she was gone. By the time he reached his teens, Ed had developed an intense sense of obedience. He rarely disagreed with anyone, often smiled nervously, and seemed eager to please. He could fix anything: tools, engines, fences. And people in town came to rely on his quiet reliability. Yet, even then, there was a strangeness about him that few could name. He had trouble understanding humor, and his reactions were sometimes unpredictable, laughing softly at things others found sad or serious. Still, no one thought much of it. In rural Wisconsin, where eccentricity was common and privacy respected, Ed's peculiarities blended into the landscape. When George Gein passed away in 1940, Ed was 34 years old. By then, the family had been on the farm for over 2 decades. Henry and Ed took on what work they could, odd jobs around town, helping with threshing, repairing roofs or engines. They lived simply, spending evenings by the stove as Augusta read from her Bible. But Henry had begun to worry about his younger brother. He saw how completely Ed depended on their mother, how he spoke of her with a kind of reverence that went beyond normal affection. Henry also saw Augusta's growing bitterness toward the world, her endless criticism of others, and how her words shaped Ed's view of life. In 1944, tragedy struck the Gein family. A brush fire broke out on their property as the brothers were burning debris. The flames spread quickly across the dry grass. The two men separated as they tried to contain it, and when Ed returned to the house, Henry was missing. Later that evening, searchers found him lifeless near the edge of the property. The official explanation was that he had been overcome by smoke. Ed, shaken and quiet, told authorities he had found the body himself. After that day, it was just Ed and his mother. Augusta's health declined soon after. A stroke left her frail, and Ed devoted himself entirely to caring for her. He cooked, cleaned, read to her, and stayed by her side through every illness. Neighbors occasionally saw him in town, always polite and reserved, but he spoke little about his life at home. When Augusta passed away in December of 1945, something in Ed seemed to fade with her. He was nearly 40, alone in the world for the first time. The farmhouse, once ruled by her stern presence, fell silent. Dust gathered in the corners. Curtains stayed drawn. Ed closed off the rooms she had used, preserving them exactly as they had been, untouched, as if she might return at any moment. From that point on, his reclusive nature deepened. He still came into town now and then, to buy supplies, to do small jobs, but people noticed how different he seemed. He spoke softly, with a kind of distracted gentleness, and often smiled as if lost in thought. Some described him as harmless, almost childlike. Others found him unsettling, though they couldn't explain why. He lived mostly on canned food, collected books, and spent long hours reading by lamplight. His farm, once full of life, began to decay. Fences leaning, barns sagging, fields turning to weeds. But to Ed, it was still home, still the place where his mother's voice lingered, where the world outside could never reach him. He had grown up under strict control, in a home where every decision was made for him. Without Augusta, there was no one to guide his thoughts, no structure to his days. The man who had always been obedient now drifted, unanchored, through a life of isolation and memory. In town, people pitied him more than anything else. They hired him to fix roofs, shovel snow, or repair machinery. He accepted little money, often content just to help. Sometimes he babysat for local children, who later recalled that he could be kind and patient, though there was something oddly distant in his manner, as if he were acting out a role he didn't quite understand. As the years passed, Ed's loneliness became a defining part of who he was. He spent his evenings reading magazines, listening to the radio, and occasionally visiting the small Plainfield tavern to watch people talk and laugh. A world he observed but never joined. He was, in every sense, a man apart. Quiet, polite, unassuming. A figure that blended into the background of a town that valued modesty and discretion. And yet, within that quiet exterior, something was changing. Slowly, invisibly, shaped by years of solitude and memories he couldn't escape. To the people of Plainfield, he was simply Ed, the man who could fix anything, who kept to himself, and who never caused trouble. No one could have guessed how deep his isolation had become, or what it might one day lead him toward. The lonely farmhouse on the edge of town stood as a symbol of that quietness, weathered, empty, and still. A place where time seemed to stop. And within its walls, Ed Gein's world narrowed further, shrinking to a handful of rooms, a few possessions, and the haunting echo of the only voice that had ever truly mattered to him. Chapter 3. Life under Augusta. Augusta Gein was not a woman who blended quietly into the world around her. Even in a region built on self-reliance and quiet endurance, Her will stood out like a granite cliff against the rolling farmland. To neighbors, she was polite but distant. To her family, she was absolute authority. She had been born in the late 1870s to German-American parents who valued hard work and religious discipline above all else. From a young age, she learned that virtue meant obedience and thrift, that temptation waited in every idle pleasure, and that faith, stern, unquestioning faith, was the only sure path through life's hardships. When she married George Gein, she hoped to build a household that reflected those principles. The world was changing quickly in the early 20th century. Automobiles on the roads, jazz music in the cities, and women beginning to speak more openly about independence. To Augusta, all of that looked like moral decline. She wanted no part of it. On the farm near Plainfield, she created her own small kingdom, and its rules were hers alone. The walls of the farmhouse were lined not with family photographs, but with religious prints, paintings of angels and saints, biblical verses written on yellowing paper. A heavy wooden cross hung above the dining table. Each evening before supper, she led her sons in prayer, her voice measured and solemn, the rhythm of the words as fixed as the ticking of the clock on the wall. Her worldview was simple but absolute. There was righteousness, and there was sin. Everything fell neatly into one of those two categories. She believed that the wider world was filled with corruption, that city life encouraged greed, vanity, and immorality. She distrusted entertainment, distrusted outsiders, and taught her sons that the only safety lay in obedience and purity. To a child, those lessons could sound comforting, the promise that goodness could protect you from harm. But as Ed grew older, those lessons became something heavier, a moral weight pressing down on every thought and action. Augusta watched her sons closely, correcting them for even the smallest misstep. She believed that discipline was love, and that sparing correction meant inviting ruin. The daily rhythm of life under Augusta was strict but predictable. The boys rose early, often before dawn, to feed livestock and tend the fields. Breakfast was eaten in silence, except for prayer. After school, they returned to chores until evening. Idle time was discouraged. When work was finished, they read the Bible aloud, page after page of parables about punishment, obedience, and redemption. On Sundays, they dressed in clean clothes and traveled into town for church. Even there, Augusta kept her sons close, rarely allowing them to mingle. She listened intently to the sermons, nodding when the pastor spoke of judgment and damnation, and afterward she would repeat the lessons on the long drive home. To the people of Plainfield, she was a respectable woman, hard-working, pious, devoted to her family. But few knew how completely she controlled the world inside her home. Neighbors who dropped by to buy farm goods or borrow tools sometimes found her cold or abrupt. She disliked casual conversation and rarely smiled. If a visitor stayed too long, she grew impatient, shifting her weight or folding her arms until they took the hint. Once the door closed, the farmhouse became its own sealed world again. Quiet, except for the creak of floorboards and the faint, steady murmur of Augusta's reading voice. She took particular pride in keeping her home spotless. The wooden floors were scrubbed until the boards were pale and dry. Curtains were washed by hand and rehung with precise folds. Every object had its place. Disorder, to Augusta, was a form of moral weakness. Her husband, George, occupied a shrinking space within this system. He still worked when he could, but his spirit dimmed under her constant judgment. When he drank, Augusta saw it not as illness or despair, but as sin, a willful rejection of her moral order. The tension between them filled the house like a quiet, ongoing storm. The boys learned to speak softly, to avoid drawing attention when tempers flared. In that atmosphere, Augusta's voice became the law. When she praised them, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. When she scolded them, her words cut deeply. Ed, especially, absorbed every tone and gesture. He came to believe that the outside world truly was dangerous. that people beyond the farm were coarse and untrustworthy, and that his mother's protection was the only thing standing between him and moral collapse. She taught him to view life in symbols, good and evil, pure and corrupt, strong and weak. There was little room for grey, and because he saw her as the embodiment of goodness, her judgments became absolute truth in his mind. Even as he reached adulthood, Ed continued to depend on her approval in the way a small child seeks comfort. When he ventured into town, he often repeated her opinions word for word. If someone mentioned a new movie, he might quietly echo her disapproval. If others joked about romance or marriage, he would grow silent, uncertain how to respond. Augusta noticed his loyalty and encouraged it, sometimes praising him as the only one who truly understood her. That bond, as comforting as it may have felt to him, left little space for independence. Life on the farm followed the same rhythm year after year. The seasons changed, the rituals did not. The same prayers, the same chores, the same long evenings under lamplight. To outsiders, such constancy might have seemed peaceful. Inside the farmhouse, it was something closer to confinement. When storms rolled over the plains, Augusta would draw the curtains and light a single lamp, speaking softly about how the Lord showed his power through wind and thunder. When illness struck neighbors, she interpreted it as a warning against sin. When local gossip reached her ears, she dismissed it as proof of the world's wickedness. To Ed, these lessons became the framework for understanding everything. He grew up seeing punishment and mercy not as human choices but as forces that governed the universe. If crops failed, it was divine displeasure. If the sun returned, it was forgiveness. His sense of cause and effect came to mirror his mother's theology rather than ordinary logic. Despite her severity, Augusta's devotion to her sons was genuine in its own way. She cooked their meals, tended to them when they were sick, and reminded them constantly that she was doing all of this for their salvation. That conviction made her unyielding. It also made her strangely fearless. She believed she could out-argue fate itself. When Henry began to question her views, suggesting that perhaps their neighbors were not as corrupt as she claimed, Augusta's disappointment cut deeply. She accused him of weakness, of straying from the narrow path. Ed witnessed those exchanges in silence, learning that love in his family could vanish the moment one doubted her authority. In later years, after George's death, Augusta's influence only intensified. She had no one to challenge her now, no husband to temper her beliefs. The farm became a sanctuary entirely of her own making, and Ed, its devoted caretaker. Her health began to fail in the early 1940s, but her mind remained sharp. Ed brought her meals, tended the fires, and read aloud when her eyesight dimmed. Even as she grew frail, she continued to preach from her chair, her voice steady and commanding. To Ed, her fragility only deepened his reverence. She seemed almost saintly to him, a figure of suffering and endurance. Those final years cemented the pattern of his life: service, isolation, and worship. When she spoke, he listened as though every word carried divine authority. When she was silent, the house seemed to hold its breath. The world outside moved on without them. The war ended, the highways improved, new families arrived in Plainfield. But on the Gein farm, time stood still. Augusta's rules remained the same, her view of humanity unchanged. And when she finally passed, she left behind more than a house and a stretch of land. She left a framework of belief so rigid that her son could never quite live outside it. He remained loyal to the image of her he had built in his mind, the pure, unbending guardian of a moral universe that existed nowhere else but in his memories. In that sense, Augusta never really left the farmhouse. Her influence lingered in every habit, every thought, every decision Ed made. The walls she built around her family did not crumble with her death. They simply became invisible, surrounding her son for the rest of his life. Chapter 4: The Passing of Family. By the 1930s, The Gein farm had already settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm, and yet the stability that Augusta demanded was beginning to fray at its edges. The family had weathered hard years before, failed crops, harsh winters, and the slow decline of George Gein's strength, but time was catching up with all of them. In the span of only a few years, the household that had once seemed unchangeable would fall silent, one voice at a time, until only Ed remained to listen to the wind moving across the empty fields. George Gein, Ed's father, had always been a man of contradictions. In youth, he had been strong and ambitious, a capable carpenter who could build a house from the ground up. But disappointment had followed him through life. The grocery he tried to run in La Crosse never prospered. Farm work wore at his body and at his pride. Drink became both his refuge and his undoing. On the farm near Plainfield, he still rose early, trying to prove that he could meet the demands of the land, yet each year the work seemed heavier. His hands shook slightly when he split firewood, and his breath shortened on cold mornings. Augusta saw weakness where others might have seen exhaustion. She met his weariness with sermons instead of sympathy. For the boys, it was a lesson in silence. When their father spoke, their mother corrected him. When he failed, she scolded him. And when he retreated into quiet, no one filled the gap. By 1940, George's health had declined sharply. The official record said he died that spring, worn down by illness and years of labor. The funeral was small, a few neighbors attended, and the pastor read brief verses about endurance and rest. Ed stood by the grave with his hands clasped tightly, not crying, not speaking. For him, grief took the shape of stillness. Afterward, he returned home with his mother and brother, and the three of them continued their chores as if the rhythm of the farm could keep sorrow away. Without George, the farmhouse grew quieter. The creak of his boots on the porch, the sound of his hammering in the shed, all of it was gone. Augusta said little about his passing. To her, it was a reminder of the wages of weakness, another warning she folded into her lessons about faith and perseverance. Ed listened carefully, absorbing her words as if they were part of scripture. Whatever doubts he might have felt, he kept them to himself. Then, Ed's brother, Henry. Of the two sons, Henry had always been the more grounded. He laughed more easily, spoke with neighbors comfortably, and sometimes hinted that he might one day move away, maybe start a family of his own. He respected his mother, but had begun to question her judgments. He worried about Ed, the way his younger brother deferred to Augusta in everything, the way he seemed unable to imagine life beyond her control. In the spring of 1944, the brothers took on seasonal work with neighboring farms, helping clear brush and repair fences. It was ordinary, back-breaking labor, the kind they had done since childhood. That May, while burning piles of debris, a sudden wind rose from the west. The fire spread quickly through the dry grass. The two men separated as they tried to control it. By evening, the flames had burned out, leaving only smoke drifting over the charred ground. When Ed returned to town, he told others that he had lost sight of his brother during the fire. Searchers set out at dusk, lanterns swinging in the dark. They found Henry a short distance from the main burn area, lying among the blackened stubble. The official word was that he had been overcome by the smoke. There was no sign of a struggle, no reason for suspicion. Accidents were common on farms. The land itself was unforgiving. Henry's death left Ed and Augusta alone together, the last two members of a family that had once filled every corner of the house. The loss seemed to confirm what Augusta had always preached, that the world beyond her control was dangerous, that only devotion and caution could keep them safe. To Ed, it felt like the narrowing of the world. Now there was no buffer between him and his mother's beliefs, no one to question, no one to balance her voice with another perspective. Not long after Henry's death, Augusta, their mother, suffered a stroke. The attack left her partially paralyzed and weakened her speech. Ed cared for her with the devotion of a lifelong disciple. He prepared her meals, tended the fire, read aloud from the Bible and from her favorite devotional texts. He managed the farm as best he could, though much of the land went untended. Neighbors occasionally saw him in town buying supplies. When asked about his mother, he answered softly that she was getting along. Few people ever visited the farmhouse. Most assumed Augusta preferred her privacy. She recovered enough to walk again, though more slowly, and resumed her habit of long moral lectures. But a second stroke followed, this one more serious. Through that final winter, she remained mostly confined to her bed. Ed sat beside her for hours, listening to her breathing, bringing her tea, or reading aloud by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. In those months, he seemed almost to merge with the rhythm of her illness, sleeping lightly, rising at every sound, speaking only when spoken to. When she passed near the end of 1945, Ed was nearly 40 years old and had never truly lived apart from her. The funeral was held in Plainfield's small church. The pastor spoke of faith and endurance. Ed stood alone in the front pew, his head bowed. When the service ended, he lingered after the others had left, staring at the flowers until the caretaker gently ushered him out. After his mother's passing, the farmhouse became a monument to her memory. Ed closed the rooms she had used, the parlor, the upstairs bedroom, the sitting room, and left them exactly as they had been, furniture covered, curtains drawn, dust settling softly on everything she had touched. He moved his own bed into a corner of the kitchen, the warmest part of the house, and lived mostly there, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and the ticking of a small clock. Without her voice, the silence of the farm grew immense. The days blurred together, sunrise, chores, solitary meals, and long hours reading. The radio was his only conversation partner, the tinny voices of distant announcers filling the space where family once had been. He kept the farm going in a modest way, cutting hay, selling a few vegetables, taking on odd jobs around town. But it was clear that the property was slowly declining. Weeds overtook the fields. The paint peeled from the porch. Shingles lifted in the wind. Yet Ed seemed content to let time stand still. Each creaking board, each fading photograph served as a reminder of what had been. To the townspeople, he remained polite and helpful. He fixed engines, shoveled snow, and accepted small payments he rarely spent. But when conversation turned personal, he deflected with a faint smile or a shrug. Few pressed him for details. In a community that valued privacy, his reticence was respected. Still, even in such a quiet town, people noticed that his isolation had deepened. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, as if always listening to something only he could hear. When he looked at the world, it was through a lens of memory. Each field, each fence post, a link to the past he refused to leave behind. The Gein farmhouse stood at the end of a long, rutted drive, its windows dark even on bright days. Children passing by would sometimes glance toward it and quicken their pace, though they could not have said why. To adults, it was simply an old homestead inhabited by a harmless bachelor. To Ed, it was the last remnant of a vanished family, a sacred space that held the echo of every word his mother had ever spoken. The loneliness that settled over that property after 1945 was not sudden. It was a slow tightening, year by year, until solitude itself became his only companion. In that emptiness, the routines of farm life continued out of habit rather than necessity. He mended fences no one crossed, tilled soil that yielded little, and watched the seasons turn like pages in a book he could not stop reading. From the road, nothing seemed unusual, but inside that aging farmhouse, the past lingered like a presence, familiar, unchanging, and endlessly patient. Chapter 5. A Town of Routine. In the years following the passing of his family, Ed Gein became a familiar presence in the town of Plainfield, though never the center of attention. He moved quietly through life, performing tasks that others found inconvenient or tiresome, and quietly weaving himself into the rhythm of a community that valued consistency and dependability. Neighbors remembered him as a man of routine. Every morning he would rise with the sun, dress in simple, sturdy clothes, and tend to the small but necessary chores that kept the farm functioning. Fences had to be repaired, tools sharpened, and animals fed. Even in the winter, when snow covered the fields and roads, he could be seen trudging across the land, shovel or sack in hand, carrying out tasks that, to an outsider, might seem insignificant. Despite his solitude, he was not entirely removed from Plainfield life. He made regular visits to the general store, where he bought groceries, feed, and supplies for the farm. Clerks recalled him as quiet and polite, never in a hurry, always paying carefully and offering a soft thank you before leaving. Occasionally, he would linger just long enough to ask a question about hardware or farming techniques, then retreat again into silence. He was a man who could fix nearly anything, and the townspeople relied on him for that. When a roof leaked or a fence broke, he would arrive with nails, boards, and tools, performing the work with steady hands and meticulous care. Unlike many others, he never demanded much pay. A few dollars, sometimes a meal, or occasionally nothing at all. People noticed this, and it became part of the unspoken understanding between him and the community. Ed Gein could be counted on, and his labor was trustworthy. His presence in town was unobtrusive. He walked the streets slowly, occasionally tipping his hat to familiar faces, occasionally stopping to greet a shopkeeper, but mostly keeping to himself. Children whispered his name when they passed by his property, but rarely dared approach him. There was something about him that felt odd, but harmless. Even strangers, passing through Plainfield for a day or two, remarked on the quiet bachelor who seemed always polite, yet always distant. Gossip was the town's way of filling silence, and Ed often became the subject of it, though never in any harmful way. People speculated about his habits, his routines, and his loyalty to his late mother. Some wondered why he spent so much time indoors, why certain rooms in the farmhouse were never entered, why he seemed almost absent even when present. The questions were never answered, but they did not diminish his reputation for reliability. In fact, some saw his eccentricity as harmless, almost quaint, the mark of a man devoted to his work and to his own quiet life. Even his errands followed a consistent pattern. He would visit the same stores, speak to the same shopkeepers, and perform the same small acts of civility. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, this repetition reinforced the image of a man predictable and safe. The children who whispered his name might later pass him in the street without recognition. The adults who commented on his oddities would shrug and continue with their day, and Ed would continue his work, unaware of the attention he had quietly garnered. There were certain times of the year when his presence became more noticeable. During harvest season, he would help local farmers with threshing or baling, quietly moving through the fields, lending his skill where needed. In winter, he might help shovel snow from a neighbor's driveway or repair a broken fence that threatened livestock. It was never done with showmanship or expectation of reward. It was simply his way of existing in the community. People began to associate him with a sense of reliability. If something needed fixing, Ed could do it. If someone needed a hand with a stubborn task, he could be counted on. Even those who found him unsettling still appreciated the work he provided. The combination of usefulness and quiet mystery created a reputation that was both ordinary and unusual. Despite his integration into daily town life, Ed remained profoundly isolated in other ways. He did not attend social gatherings, he did not marry or court, and he avoided the more casual conversations that often defined rural communities. His presence was tolerated and respected, but he never became fully part of the social fabric. People knew of him, relied on him, and occasionally whispered about him, but he was always a peripheral figure, observed from a distance, not fully understood. Routine defined his existence. Days were predictable, Weeks followed similar patterns, and the passage of time became almost ceremonial. Every visit to the store, every repair job, every careful walk through the town became part of a rhythm he could rely upon. For Ed, these routines were both a necessity and a comfort. The structure of work and repetition allowed him to move through life without disruption, to keep the outside world at a manageable distance, and to navigate a community that valued familiarity and order. Yet within that predictability lay an underlying tension, invisible to most. The quiet, orderly life he led was a world bounded by memory, habit, and the lingering influence of a family that no longer existed. Every visit to the store reminded him of neighbors he had known as a child. Every repair job echoed the lessons his mother had instilled, and every solitary evening returned him to the farmhouse, where silence and solitude waited patiently. As the years passed, the town of Plainfield adapted to his presence in much the same way that he adapted to theirs. He was a figure of routine, a man whose life was largely defined by work, habit, and careful observation. He could be seen moving along familiar streets, performing necessary tasks, interacting quietly with neighbors, and then returning to his home, where the world outside the farmhouse became a distant hum. People in the town grew used to his ways, to the sound of his boots on the frost-covered ground, to the occasional knock at the hardware store counter, to the presence of a man who could be counted on for skill and service, and yet never truly known. They respected his abilities, tolerated his oddities, and allowed him to exist as he wished. In a place like Plainfield, where predictability was valued above excitement, where neighbors depended on one another to maintain the land and the community, Ed Gein fit perfectly into the rhythm of everyday life. He was at once ordinary and apart, an unassuming presence whose work spoke more loudly than any words he might offer. The town moved around him, seasons turned, and years slipped by. Children grew into adults, neighbors aged, and the farm changed slowly with the passing of time. And through it all, Ed remained constant. A quiet man in a quiet town, performing odd jobs, visiting stores, participating in small-town routines, and quietly shaping his life in ways few could see or understand. In the patterns of his work, in the predictability of his errands, and in the quiet acceptance of his neighbors, Ed Gein became part of Plainfield, not as a figure of spectacle, but as an integral, almost invisible thread in the fabric of the community. To those who observed him from a distance, he was dependable, reliable, perhaps a little strange, but ultimately just another man in a small town, quietly moving through life, unnoticed except by those who took the time to see. Chapter 6. Rumors and Eccentricities. Even in a town as quiet as Plainfield, it is difficult for complete oddities to go unnoticed. People notice patterns, differences, and behaviors that diverge from the ordinary. And over time, Ed Gein's peculiarities became the subject of quiet observation and whispered speculation. Even though, on the surface, he remained polite, helpful, and unobtrusive. It began with small things. The way he walked through town, for instance. Always careful, measured, deliberate. He rarely looked directly at anyone for long. He spoke softly, if at all, and rarely laughed. Children remarked to each other that he seemed different, but they were never afraid of him. He was far too gentle to inspire fear. Adults noticed the same thing. There was something unusual, almost theatrical, in the way he carried himself, but it was never threatening. Ed had habits that set him apart. He preferred to work alone, even when help would have been appreciated. He wandered the fields and forests surrounding the farmhouse, sometimes staying out long after neighbors had returned indoors. When asked what he was doing, he might offer a vague reply, checking fences, fixing a gate, or tending to the land. He did not seek attention for these efforts. He simply did them, and then returned home. One of the most talked about aspects of his life was his collecting. He had an interest in items that others considered unusual: newspapers, books, and various materials from around the farm. These were gathered carefully, catalogued in his own way, and stored in the farmhouse or barn. To neighbors, it seemed harmless, perhaps eccentric. He was, after all, a man of habit and meticulous attention to detail. Collecting things that might otherwise have been discarded was not necessarily threatening. It was simply part of the order he imposed on his world. He also had a peculiar sense of privacy. Certain rooms in the farmhouse were never entered by others. Curtains were kept drawn, and doors remained closed. Outsiders speculated about why, but Ed never offered an explanation. He was friendly when approached, yet there was always a distance, a quiet boundary he would not allow anyone to cross. For those who knew him, this boundary became accepted. Everyone had their private space, and Ed's was simply larger and more impermeable than most. Gossip circulated quietly through the town. People wondered about his habits, about the things he collected, and about the solitary life he led. Some whispered that he spent too much time alone. Others speculated that he was simply shy or socially awkward. Children dared each other to walk past the farmhouse, pointing out shadows in the windows or the odd shapes of items stored in the barn. Adults, meanwhile, filed the information away as just Ed being Ed, noting that he was harmless and that no one had reason to be concerned. Despite the whispers, the general consensus remained consistent. Ed Gein was unusual, but not dangerous. He did not engage in arguments, he did not cause property damage, and he never intruded on anyone's life. He fulfilled odd jobs with precision, bought supplies respectfully, and moved through the town with minimal disruption. In a community accustomed to eccentric neighbors, his strangeness became a tolerated, almost quaint fact of life. It is important to note the nature of perception in a small town. People observed behavior, interpreted it, and made judgments based on limited information. In Ed's case, his habits, solitary walks, collecting materials, meticulous maintenance of the farmhouse, created a reputation for oddity without malice. It was the kind of difference that can provoke curiosity, sometimes amusement, sometimes discomfort, but rarely alarm. Neighbors noticed other aspects of his life as well. He was extremely clean, meticulous in his dress, careful in his speech. Nothing was ever out of place, no task ever half finished. Some interpreted this as obsessive behavior, but again, it did not harm anyone else. It simply added to the sense that Ed lived by his own rules, quietly separate from the social rhythms of Plainfield. He also moved at his own pace. While other men in town might hurry to complete tasks or attend social events, Ed followed a deliberate schedule determined by habit and personal necessity. He rarely deviated from routines established over decades. This predictability, strange as it might have seemed, further reinforced the town's view of him as harmless. They knew what to expect from Ed, and in many ways, that made him safe. Some neighbors were curious about the interior of the farmhouse, but few ever ventured inside. Augusta's influence lingered after her death. The house itself seemed to maintain her sense of order and moral authority. Ed kept to rooms he used daily and avoided areas that had belonged to his mother or brother. This preservation of space was both a tribute and a continuation of the household routines he had grown up with, and it added another layer to the town's perception of him. He was eccentric, yes, but disciplined, almost reverent in his habits. It is also worth noting that Ed's eccentricities were never flamboyant or aggressive. He did not seek attention. He did not perform acts to shock others or to test limits. His behaviors were contained within his own life, largely unnoticed unless someone took deliberate note. Collecting, repairing, walking through the fields, tending the animals. These were all activities consistent with self-sufficiency, magnified only by his isolation and his quiet demeanor. Rumors often gain power, not because of evidence, but because of absence, because something is unexplained or unknown. In Ed's case, the gaps in his life, the closed rooms, the extended periods outdoors, the meticulous collection of objects, created fertile ground for speculation. Neighbors might say, he's peculiar, he's odd, or he keeps to himself. And the statement was true, yet it never crossed into accusation. For decades, the perception of harmlessness remained intact. Children, naturally, were fascinated. They might peer through windows, follow him along dirt paths, or whisper stories to one another about what he might be doing in the farmhouse. Adults dismissed these stories as harmless imagination, often reinforcing the notion that Ed Gein was simply a quiet, reliable, and eccentric man. Even within the town, opinions about him varied. Some admired his work ethic, his ability to repair and maintain, his knowledge of the land and the tools he used. Others were quietly amused by his oddities, remarking on them in conversation, but never challenging him directly. A few found him strange or unnerving, but there was nothing in his daily life that suggested he posed a risk. In truth, Ed's eccentricities were inseparable from his solitude. Living alone on a remote farm, with decades of habits cultivated under his mother's strict guidance, his life had evolved into a series of careful routines, quiet collections, and deliberate movements through the world. For the people of Plainfield, he was an enigma. For Ed, it was simply existence. And so he continued, quiet, methodical, largely unobserved, except by those who passed him on the street or noted his presence at the store. A man whose life was defined by habit, solitude, and a deep adherence to order. In the eyes of the town, he was peculiar, yes, but fundamentally harmless. A fixture in the fabric of daily life, blending the ordinary and the extraordinary in a way that left him both noticed and unnoticed. In this way, the rumors and whispers of the community were contained. They described him, debated him quietly, and then returned to their own lives. Ed continued his routines, collected his objects, and moved through the days with the same precision and silence he had maintained for years. The perception of harmlessness endured, and with it, the rhythm of his life remained unbroken, predictable, solitary, and strangely consistent. Chapter 7. The Vanishing of Bernice Worden. Plainfield, by the mid-1950s, was still a town defined by routine and quiet predictability. People moved through their lives with a careful rhythm, tending farms, running small businesses, visiting neighbors, and observing the familiar landscape of streets, fields, and forests. But in the late autumn of 1957, that rhythm was disturbed by an event that would ripple through the community, leaving a lasting mark on its memory. Bernice Worden, a middle-aged woman who operated the local hardware store, was well known to the townspeople. She was diligent, practical, and respected, a steady presence in the town's daily life. Her store was a hub for farmers, handymen, and residents seeking supplies for ordinary tasks. They came for nails, tools, feed, or advice, and she served them with calm efficiency. She knew many of the townspeople by name, often offering a friendly greeting or a small piece of advice along with the transaction. On a crisp morning in late November, Bernice did not arrive at her store as expected. The hardware store, normally a site of gentle bustle, remained closed through the morning and into the early afternoon. Neighbors initially assumed she might have been delayed by weather, errands, or a personal matter. Plainfield winters were harsh, and snow or ice often slowed travel, especially for those traveling by foot or by car on unplowed roads. As the hours passed, concern grew. Some townspeople visited the store to check on her. They found the doors locked and the lights off, and the usual orderly displays left untouched. Mail had begun to accumulate at the doorway, a small but unusual sign in a town where daily attention to one's business was expected. Conversations began to stir in the streets and homes. "Have you seen Bernice? And something must have happened." By the end of the day, the worry had spread. Friends and neighbors contacted family members, while others checked the surrounding areas. The woods and farmland outside town, familiar and often used for short walks or chores, were searched briefly by locals, though they were vast and difficult to navigate. Plainfield was small, yes, but it was surrounded by dense forest, winding streams, and hidden paths. Anyone moving outside the town boundaries could be hard to find. The following morning, the concern became more urgent. Bernice had still not appeared. Friends and neighbors began speaking with the few people who had been in the area the previous day. No one reported seeing her leave the store. There were no clear signs of struggle or disturbance. The town had no reason to suspect immediate danger. Still, the absence of someone so regular and predictable was unsettling. Word eventually reached the local authorities. The Portage County Sheriff's Office became involved, and the investigation formally began. Plainfield, a town where police presence was minimal and most matters were handled by neighbors or local volunteers, now experienced a sense of focus and attention that had been rare in its history. Residents, accustomed to calm, began to discuss possibilities quietly: illness, accident, personal emergency. Few could imagine a more serious scenario, yet the pattern of her absence suggested that something unusual had occurred. The sheriff and deputies began to organize a methodical search. They checked the store thoroughly, examined surrounding fields, barns, and outbuildings, and interviewed neighbors about Bernice's recent movements. People recalled small details. She had been friendly but somewhat distracted the previous week, mentioning the upcoming winter and planning errands. Nothing suggested imminent danger, and yet, as the day wore on, the fact that she remained missing cast a shadow over the town. In small towns, disappearance is always noticed. Unlike in a city, where missing persons might be one of many, here everyone had known her for years. People recalled running into her on errands, speaking with her in passing, or visiting her store on cold mornings to purchase firewood or tools. Each interaction now became a point of reflection, a last smile, a final greeting, a small wave that now felt loaded with significance. The townspeople began to share their observations in hushed tones. Some mentioned seeing Ed Gein around that time, tending to odd jobs or moving quietly through town. Others dismissed the idea, noting that Ed had always been a helpful neighbor, quiet but harmless. Still, the mention of his name began to circulate, not as accusation, but as part of a web of curiosity and concern. Search efforts expanded. Plainfield residents combed nearby woods, walked along the riverbanks, and checked outbuildings that were usually left unexamined. Authorities logged their findings carefully, noting the absence of any obvious evidence of an accident or altercation. Yet, as hours turned into days, the realization settled in. Bernice Worden had disappeared under circumstances that were unclear, and the community that relied on her regular presence was unsettled. By the end of the week, the story had become a quiet concern that touched nearly every home. Plainfield, a town accustomed to the predictability of daily life, had been confronted with an unanticipated disruption. Neighbors began speaking more cautiously about routines. Children noticed adults whispering in low voices, and the usual order of the town, work, chores, errands, continued under a subtle tension. It was during this period of uncertainty that law enforcement began organizing a formal, thorough investigation. Officers returned to the store, documenting the scene carefully. They spoke to residents again, seeking any fragment of observation that might shed light on her disappearance. Small inconsistencies, odd recollections, and overlooked details began to emerge. While nothing at the time pointed definitively to a suspect, the collective sense of unease in the town grew. The vanishing of Bernice Worden marked a turning point for Plainfield. Until then, life had been defined by routine and quiet eccentricity. Now, the town faced a reminder that even in familiar, orderly surroundings, uncertainty could intrude unexpectedly. Conversations, once about crops or weather, shifted to concern for neighbors and questions about where she might be. Every closed door, every silent farmhouse seemed to carry a little more weight. Though the days following her disappearance were filled with meticulous searching and careful questioning, the event left a lingering sense of disruption. The people of Plainfield were left to wonder, how could someone known so well, seen almost daily, vanish without explanation? How could the life of the town, so stable and predictable, encounter a moment of uncertainty so profound? In a town defined by routine, the absence of Bernice Worden became a focal point, a quiet disturbance that unsettled the rhythm of daily life. Neighbors watched one another more closely. Farmers paused in their work to consider the fragility of daily existence. And the hardware store, once a place of steady business, became a symbol of mystery and concern. For Ed Gein, who had long existed at the edge of town life, the event marked the beginning of a shift in attention, curiosity, and scrutiny. What had previously been whispered observation and mild speculation would now give way to investigation. The rhythms of Plainfield were no longer undisturbed, and the story of a quiet town, a quiet man, and a missing neighbor began to unfold in ways that would leave a lasting impression on both the community and history. Chapter 8. The investigation begins. When Bernice Worden failed to appear at her hardware store for several days, the sense of unease in Plainfield slowly deepened. By this point, her absence was no longer something neighbors could dismiss as an ordinary delay or minor misfortune. Concern had grown into action, and the sheriff of Portage County officially began the investigation. Law enforcement arrived in Plainfield with quiet efficiency. In a small town, officers were well-known figures, and their presence was both reassuring and a sign that something unusual had occurred. Deputies began by retracing Bernice's last known movements. They spoke to neighbors, local business owners, and anyone who might have seen her on the days leading up to her disappearance. They recorded statements carefully, noting the details of routine interactions, transactions, and errands. The investigation was methodical. Authorities documented the exterior of the hardware store, noting the position of doors, windows, and displays. They inspected the surrounding property, walked the streets near the store, and observed any signs of unusual activity. Even in a town accustomed to quiet life, this level of attention to daily surroundings was unfamiliar, and it drew the curiosity of local residents. People paused in their own tasks to watch officers at work, whispering questions to each other about what might have happened. Search parties were organized. Local farmers, friends, and volunteers offered to help, combing nearby fields, barns, and wooded areas. It was difficult work. The land surrounding Plainfield was a patchwork of farmland, dense forest, and hidden paths. Every tree line, fence row, and barn structure became a potential location to examine. Neighbors moved slowly, calling out names and checking for signs, aware that the terrain itself could obscure even obvious clues. The sheriff coordinated these efforts with quiet authority. He directed volunteers to split into teams, each covering a different sector. Officers maintained communication with town residents, asking questions and listening carefully to even minor observations. Plainfield, small as it was, had a network of informal communication. Word of mouth spread quickly, and the sheriff had to balance the urgency of gathering facts with the natural flow of town life. Community reaction was varied, though generally measured. Residents were concerned, some deeply so, but there was little panic. People watched carefully, listened to updates from friends and family, and assisted where possible. The disappearance of someone so familiar, someone whose daily presence had been part of the town's rhythm for years, created a subtle shift in perspective. Neighbors were reminded of how fragile the ordinary could be, how quickly routine could be disrupted. During this period, rumors inevitably began to circulate. People shared what they had observed in quiet conversations, noting small details that might otherwise have been overlooked. Some remembered seeing Bernice in town on the day she disappeared, walking with her usual careful pace, interacting with patrons at the store, exchanging greetings. Others recounted noticing Ed Gein performing odd jobs nearby, moving through town or fields at his usual measured speed. These observations were carefully documented by law enforcement. Each statement, each recollection, became part of the formal record. Investigators were aware that even small details could prove significant, and in a community as small as Plainfield, every piece of information had weight. Officers also inspected the Gein farmhouse, though at this stage their approach was cautious. They noted the isolated location of the property, its proximity to town, and Ed's long-standing reputation as a quiet, dependable neighbor. At this point, there was no indication of wrongdoing. Investigators were gathering facts, building a timeline, and observing the routines of both Bernice and those around her. The town itself felt the shift. Stores, farms, and homes all took on a slightly heightened awareness. Residents moved more deliberately, checking on one another and noticing patterns they might previously have ignored. Even the local children, who had once whispered about Ed's eccentricities, sensed the tension and spoke less openly. Conversations focused on factual observations: who had seen Bernice last, where she might have been, and what neighbors could remember about her schedule. Searches continued over several days, extending into areas that were less frequently visited. Officers walked through thick woods, across frozen streams, and along narrow farm roads. Volunteers assisted with this work, offering both manpower and local knowledge of the land. Every barn, shed, and abandoned outbuilding was examined. While no immediate conclusions were reached, the thoroughness of the investigation reassured the town that authorities were taking the disappearance seriously. Throughout this process, Ed Gein remained a figure of quiet presence. He continued his work on the farm, performed minor repairs for neighbors, and visited the store as usual. Observers noted his calm demeanor, his steady routines, and the absence of any outward reaction beyond his normal reserve. For townspeople accustomed to his presence, this continuity was both reassuring and curious. The investigation, in these early stages, emphasized observation, documentation, and methodical questioning. Officers took care to maintain a factual perspective, avoiding speculation and focusing on gathering evidence. Every lead, no matter how small, was followed. Times of day, locations, interactions with neighbors, and even seemingly trivial tasks became important pieces of the puzzle. Plainfield, a town shaped by quiet days and predictable routines, was now the scene of focused attention. While fear did not dominate, there was a palpable sense of caution. People began to notice the ways in which ordinary life could be disrupted, and the disappearance of Bernice Worden became a lens through which the town measured its own vulnerabilities and the limits of their understanding of those around them. As the search continued, a slow tension settled over the town. Residents went about their work and daily tasks, but always with a subtle awareness. Someone was missing, and the ordinary rhythms of life could not entirely mask that absence. Conversations were careful, observations sharper, and the town moved as a collective of quiet attention, all in service of finding answers. Through these efforts, the sheriff and his deputies established the initial framework of the investigation. They documented the timeline, spoke to all relevant witnesses, and organized search teams. They remained professional and methodical, treating each statement and observation with equal importance. Their diligence reflected both the seriousness of the situation and the scale of the community in which they operated. And so, Plainfield entered a period in which routine and uncertainty coexisted. Life continued. Fields were plowed, stores remained open, neighbors tended to chores. But beneath the surface, the town was watchful. Every closed door, every quiet road, every familiar figure moving through the landscape became a potential clue. In a place defined by habit and predictability, the disappearance of Bernice Worden was a reminder that even the smallest disruption could reverberate through a community, drawing attention, concern, and the careful scrutiny of those sworn to maintain order. Chapter 9: A Shocking Discovery. As law enforcement expanded their investigation into Bernice Worden's disappearance, the focus inevitably turned to the Gein farmhouse. To the outside observer, the house had always appeared ordinary, even orderly. Its exterior showed signs of decades of maintenance, with a neat yard, simple structures, and a farmhouse that blended into the rural landscape of Plainfield. Inside, however, investigators would uncover evidence that was both unusual and historically significant, reflecting decades of private, secret activity. Officers approached the property with caution. The farmhouse had long been known as the home of a solitary man, one whose habits and routines were unusual, but generally considered harmless. Yet within its walls, law enforcement discovered items that were entirely outside the realm of ordinary expectation. Some of the most notable findings involved objects that had been modified or created from materials that investigators would later confirm were of human origin. Furniture, chairs, benches, and tables had been altered. Bowls, containers, and lampshades had been fashioned in ways that were deeply unusual, reflecting a precise and meticulous process. Masks and other items were arranged carefully, often stored in closets, drawers, or other hidden spaces. Among the discoveries were masks, belts, and garments made from human skin. Investigators catalogued and photographed each item, noting the care and attention that had gone into its creation. Some items corresponded to specific parts of the body, and others had been shaped into forms intended for personal use or display. Law enforcement worked carefully to document every detail, maintaining professional standards and preserving the evidence for both analysis and legal proceedings. In addition to furniture and personal items, investigators noted the presence of 9 altered garments and objects that appeared to have been created with precise, repetitive techniques. Some of these included representations of human features, including masks or coverings that had been shaped to fit over the head or face. Law enforcement recorded these findings systematically, ensuring that each object's location, size, and arrangement was accurately documented. The farmhouse contained hundreds of items, many of them stored in an almost ritualized order. Closets, drawers, and boxes held collections that reflected decades of habit, planning, and careful placement. Officers observed that the layout of the home and the storage of these objects reflected a meticulous, methodical mind, one that had worked alone for years to create a private system of organization. Neighbors, when later informed of the discovery, were shocked but also puzzled. Many had lived near Ed Gein for years, aware of his eccentric routines, his quiet demeanor, and his isolated existence. Yet the scale and nature of what was found inside the farmhouse exceeded anything they had imagined. It became clear that the home, which had outwardly appeared ordinary, contained decades of secretive activity that had gone entirely unnoticed by the broader community. The investigators emphasized careful documentation. Each object was catalogued, measured, photographed, and secured. Officers made detailed notes about the materials, construction methods, and possible purposes of each item. Their goal was to preserve a complete record of the environment and to understand the context of these discoveries in relation to Bernice Worden's disappearance and the life of Ed Gein. While the discoveries were historically shocking, the reporting remained factual and measured. Law enforcement and later forensic experts refrained from sensationalism, instead focusing on patterns of behavior, evidence of meticulous planning, and the long-term, solitary habits of the homeowner. These items provided insight into the mindset, routines, and obsessions that had characterized Ed Gein's life for decades. The farmhouse, once a quiet symbol of solitary rural living, had become a site of intense scrutiny. Officers moved carefully through every room, attic, and outbuilding, recording the unusual arrangements and creations. Each object told a piece of the story, of isolation, of obsessive attention to detail, and of a private life that had unfolded largely beyond the notice of neighbors and the town at large. By the end of the initial investigation, law enforcement had amassed a complete record of the farmhouse. Furniture, personal items, masks, belts, and other objects many crafted from human material, had been documented and secured. The focus remained on historical accuracy, factual reporting, and understanding the scope of what had occurred. The goal was to provide clarity about a situation that had otherwise been mysterious, tying the discoveries to Ed Gein's long-established routines and solitary habits. This moment marked a turning point in the case. The town of Plainfield, previously accustomed to the quiet eccentricities of a solitary neighbor, now faced the reality of evidence that was extraordinary, unsettling, and unprecedented in the community's memory. The farmhouse, once a symbol of ordinary isolation, had revealed decades of hidden activity that would become central to the investigation, the trial, and the broader historical record. In documenting the findings, law enforcement and later experts sought to maintain a balance, fully accurate, entirely factual, and careful to present the information in a measured way that focused on investigation and evidence rather than lurid storytelling. Every detail was catalogued, analyzed, and preserved for understanding, providing a record that would inform the community, the legal system, and historical accounts for decades to come. The discovery within the farmhouse was thus both shocking and illuminating. It revealed the scope of a private, solitary life conducted in secrecy, the meticulous habits of a man who had lived for decades in isolation, and the objects that ultimately connected to the disappearance of Bernice Worden. Through careful investigation, Plainfield and the wider world gained a factual understanding of events that, until then, had been hidden behind the quiet walls of the farmhouse. Chapter 10: Questioning and Confession. After the discoveries in the farmhouse, Ed Gein was taken into custody for questioning. For the town of Plainfield and the officers involved, this was a moment that combined both relief and apprehension. The mystery of Bernice Worden's disappearance had led to a concrete subject of investigation, yet the scope of what had been found was deeply unsettling. The task now was to understand Ed's role in these events, his intentions, and his perspective. Ed himself presented as unusually calm, quiet, and cooperative. In the presence of law enforcement, he did not exhibit anger or resistance. Instead, he answered questions slowly, deliberately, and with a level of detachment that reflected decades of solitary living. Investigators noted that his speech was often flat, his tone even, and his focus narrowly directed to the questions posed rather than any broader context of the situation. During initial questioning, Ed displayed confusion about the nature and consequences of his actions. He appeared disconnected from societal norms, offering explanations that suggested he did not fully comprehend how others would interpret his behavior. His answers were literal and factual, sometimes skipping over emotional context entirely. He spoke of his activities in terms of utility, habit, or curiosity, rather than malice. At times, Ed's statements reflected a mixture of memory lapses and selective recall. He would describe certain tasks or events with precision, yet when asked about broader motives or personal feelings, he often seemed uncertain or incapable of providing a coherent explanation. Law enforcement and later forensic experts interpreted this as an indication of both social isolation and underlying psychological issues that had developed over decades of solitary living and intense maternal influence during childhood. As questioning continued, Ed gradually began to acknowledge the scope of his activities. He admitted to involvement with certain objects and items found in the farmhouse, confirming their origin and use. His tone remained matter-of-fact, without overt emotion or elaboration. He did not embellish details, nor did he resist providing information once asked. Investigators recorded every statement meticulously, recognizing the importance of accurate documentation for legal and psychiatric purposes. Law enforcement and later psychiatric evaluators noted that Ed appeared to struggle with understanding the impact of his actions on others. He could describe processes, explain how he created certain items, and recount routines, yet he seemed unable to fully grasp why these actions would disturb or harm the broader community. In his own mind, many of the activities were extensions of habit, memory, or a personal sense of order, rather than deliberate wrongdoing. During the interviews, Ed also discussed his relationship with his mother, Augusta, and the influence she had on his worldview. He spoke of her strict moral codes, her teachings about sin, and her insistence on separation from others who she deemed impure or dangerous. Investigators interpreted these recollections as central to understanding Ed's mental state. The combination of isolation, maternal authority, and rigid upbringing had shaped his perception of normalcy and morality. While some parts of his confession were limited, investigators were able to piece together timelines and details that helped explain the presence of certain objects in the farmhouse. Ed was forthcoming when asked about specific items, acknowledging their origin and purpose. He cooperated fully with requests to identify locations within the property, describe routines, and provide context for the unusual arrangements he had created over the years. Throughout the questioning, Ed displayed no outward attempts to deceive or manipulate. His cooperation was consistent, and he seemed genuinely unaware of the full implications of what investigators considered criminal behavior. He spoke slowly, measuredly, as if recounting a sequence of events for an audience entirely separate from himself. In many ways, his detachment reinforced the impression of a man shaped by isolation and habit, rather than intentional malice. Investigators also noted his tendency to blend factual reporting with personal interpretation. He could describe how he made certain objects or what he had done on a particular day, yet his explanations often included reasoning that was difficult for outsiders to follow. He described actions as practical or necessary in his own system of understanding, sometimes referencing beliefs instilled by his mother or habits formed over decades of solitary living. As questioning progressed, law enforcement worked alongside psychiatric experts to ensure that Ed's mental state was properly evaluated. They observed his behavior, mannerisms, and speech patterns carefully. The goal was not only to understand what he had done, but also why he had done it, and to assess his capacity to participate meaningfully in the legal process. His responses suggested both confusion and partial insight. He recognized certain outcomes of his actions, but did not fully internalize their moral or social implications. By the conclusion of these interviews, investigators had gathered a detailed account of Ed Gein's routines, practices, and the origins of the objects found in his home. His cooperation allowed authorities to establish timelines, verify evidence, and create a factual record of his life and activities. At the same time, his detachment, literal responses, and psychological complexity presented challenges for both law enforcement and the psychiatric professionals involved. The questioning phase ultimately revealed a man who was solitary, meticulous, and profoundly influenced by childhood experiences, whose understanding of social norms was incomplete, and whose habitual behaviors had developed into patterns that were both extraordinary and historically significant. While the scale of his actions was startling, his demeanor and cooperation emphasized that his motivations were tied less to overt malice than to decades of isolation, mental health issues, and rigid upbringing. For the town of Plainfield, this phase of the investigation brought a combination of answers and continued uncertainty. People learned that Ed had indeed been responsible for activities previously unknown, but the full context of his mental state, his confusion, and his adherence to long-established routines added layers of complexity to the community's understanding. It was now clear that the man who had long lived quietly on the edge of town was central to the mystery, yet he was not easily understood in conventional terms. By the end of the questioning, Ed Gein had provided a factual, detailed, and largely literal account of his activities. Investigators had a clear understanding of what had occurred, the locations of significant objects, and the origins of key items discovered in the farmhouse. The legal and psychiatric process could now move forward, grounded in a comprehensive factual record. while the town of Plainfield adjusted to the reality that a quiet, reclusive neighbor had lived a private life filled with habits, routines, and creations that were extraordinary, unusual, and historically significant. Chapter 11. Psychiatric Evaluations. Following Ed Gein's confession and the discoveries within the farmhouse, the next phase of the case involved a detailed examination of his mental state. Law enforcement and the legal system recognized that understanding the psychological dimensions of his behavior would be essential to determining both legal responsibility and appropriate care. This led to the involvement of psychiatric professionals and the early practice of forensic psychology, an area that, at the time, was still developing in clarity and methodology. Ed was transferred to a psychiatric facility where he underwent a series of evaluations conducted by experienced doctors and psychologists. These assessments were careful, methodical, and aimed at understanding the interplay between his upbringing, isolation, personality traits, and the behaviors revealed by the investigation. Professionals observed his demeanor, speech patterns, cognitive abilities, and emotional responses, creating a comprehensive profile of his mental functioning. During interviews, Ed appeared calm, compliant, and measured. He responded to questions slowly, deliberately, and often in a literal manner, providing factual accounts of his past actions, his routines, and the circumstances of the discoveries made in his home. He demonstrated the ability to recall events with precision, yet he frequently seemed unaware of how his actions might be perceived by others outside his own frame of reference. Psychiatrists noted that Ed exhibited traits consistent with long-term social isolation and obsessive behavior. His upbringing, dominated by a strict, authoritarian mother, had instilled a rigid worldview in which certain concepts of morality, sin, and personal conduct were internalized to an extreme degree. These early influences, combined with decades of solitude following the deaths of his father and brother, contributed to patterns of thought and behavior that diverged sharply from societal norms. Assessments indicated that Ed had difficulty distinguishing between conventional social norms and his personal interpretations of right and wrong. He demonstrated an awareness of factual consequences, but his moral reasoning was shaped more by habit, fear of perceived sin, and long-standing routines than by shared social understanding. Psychiatric reports described him as intelligent and articulate, yet socially and emotionally constrained by a lifetime of isolation and maternal influence. During the evaluation process, professionals examined Ed's motivations and thought processes in creating the objects found in his farmhouse. They considered his actions in the context of ritualistic patterns, repetition, and obsessive attention to detail. While his behaviors were historically unusual and disturbing, they were also interpreted as manifestations of compulsive habits, intense fixation, and distorted understandings of life and death, rather than deliberate malice or impulsive criminality. It was during these evaluations that the question of competency for trial arose. Legal authorities needed to determine whether Ed could participate meaningfully in his own defense and understand the proceedings against him. Psychiatrists provided careful opinions. They described him as mentally competent in factual knowledge of the situation, yet limited in his ability to appreciate fully the emotional and societal ramifications of his actions. This distinction would later play a central role in the legal outcomes of the case. Ed's institutionalization began at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, later known as Mendota Mental Health Institute. Here, he entered a structured environment where both supervision and treatment were provided. Staff worked to maintain routines, observe behavior, and continue evaluation of his mental and emotional state. In this controlled setting, Ed could maintain the order and predictability he had long relied upon, while psychiatric professionals could monitor his mental health closely and provide interventions as necessary. Life in the institution reflected both care and containment. Ed followed a schedule of daily activities, including meals, chores, and supervised recreation. He continued to display meticulous habits, aligning with patterns established during his decades of solitary living. Staff observed that these routines were crucial to his sense of stability and contributed to a calmer state of mind, reducing potential agitation or confusion. Psychiatrists continued to monitor Ed over time, documenting changes, consistencies, and responses to structured living. They noted that, while he adapted to certain aspects of institutional life, his thought processes, interests, and attachments remained rooted in early experiences and decades of isolation. His mental health assessments emphasized the importance of understanding long-term environmental and developmental factors in shaping behavior, a principle that was increasingly recognized in early forensic psychology. Reports from the evaluations highlighted several key findings. First, Ed demonstrated obsessive-compulsive tendencies, often manifesting in repetitive behaviors and precise attention to objects and routines. Second, he exhibited social and emotional deficits, particularly in understanding or interpreting others' reactions. Third, he showed strong maternal influence, internalized from his upbringing, which had shaped his worldview and moral reasoning. Fourth, he had intact cognitive function, with clear memory, speech, and problem-solving abilities, even as his interpretations of social norms remained limited. Throughout his institutionalization, Ed's case became an example for forensic psychologists and legal professionals of how early environmental factors, isolation, and obsessive behaviors could converge in ways that were historically unusual and legally significant. His evaluations contributed to broader understanding in the emerging field of criminal psychology, particularly in examining the intersection of mental illness, habitual behavior, and criminal acts. For the town of Plainfield, news of Ed's transfer to the psychiatric facility offered a measure of closure and reassurance. He was no longer in the community, yet his case continued to be a topic of discussion and reflection. Residents recognized that the man they had known quietly for decades was now being examined carefully by experts, in a manner intended to both protect the community and address the unique needs of the individual involved. The psychiatric evaluations, thorough and systematic, established a foundation for both the legal proceedings that would follow and the ongoing historical record. They emphasized observation, factual reporting, and professional judgment rather than sensationalism. Through this process, the complex picture of Ed Gein as a solitary, obsessive, and psychologically unique individual became clearer. By the end of this phase, it was understood that Ed's behavior, while extraordinary and historically significant, was closely tied to a combination of mental health factors, prolonged isolation, and early familial influence. His institutionalization allowed for careful monitoring, treatment, and study, ensuring both public safety and a deeper understanding of a life shaped by circumstances that few outside his immediate environment could have imagined. Chapter 12. Media Frenzy. As news of Ed Gein's arrest and the discoveries in his farmhouse began to emerge beyond the small town of Plainfield, the story quickly captured the attention of newspapers, radio, and the broader public. For a community accustomed to quiet routines, this sudden spotlight was unusual, intense, and far-reaching. Journalists arrived in the town seeking details, interviews, and photographs, bringing with them a style of reporting that often emphasized curiosity, drama, and the extraordinary nature of the case. National and regional newspapers published headlines that highlighted the unusual aspects of the discoveries. Items from the farmhouse, the solitary life of Ed Gein, and the disappearance of Bernice Worden were described with a focus on peculiarity and mystery. While reporters aimed to relay facts, the combination of unusual artifacts and a solitary rural life created a story that was inherently sensational in the public eye. Some publications went further, using attention-grabbing language to emphasize the strangeness of the case. Words like bizarre, shocking, and gruesome appeared alongside factual reporting, framing the narrative in a way that drew readers while sometimes overshadowing the underlying events themselves. Articles often combined descriptions of the discoveries with speculation about motive, psychology, and the potential for similar incidents elsewhere, creating a mix of fact and conjecture. Despite the sensationalized tone in some media outlets, many journalists attempted to remain accurate in the details they reported. They described the items found in the farmhouse, Ed's solitary habits, and the timeline of Bernice Worden's disappearance. Reports included verified information from law enforcement and official statements, while occasionally adding context about Plainfield, its residents, and the historical backdrop of rural Wisconsin in the 1950s. The coverage quickly spread beyond Wisconsin, reaching readers in other states and even other countries. The combination of a rural setting, a solitary and reclusive individual, and the unusual nature of the farmhouse's contents created a story that was widely shared, discussed, and referenced. For some readers, it became an almost archetypal story of isolation and mystery. For others, it was an illustration of the unexpected ways ordinary life could intersect with extraordinary circumstances. Local residents experienced the effects of this media attention firsthand. Reporters sought interviews, photographed streets, and requested statements about the town, the neighbors, and Ed Gein himself. For many, this intrusion into daily life was unsettling. A community accustomed to privacy and routine suddenly found itself observed, questioned, and written about in newspapers and magazines, with readers far removed from Plainfield forming impressions based on partial information, dramatic phrasing, and speculation. Some journalists highlighted Ed's background and upbringing, discussing the influence of his mother, the deaths of his family members, and the isolation that had defined much of his life. Others focused on the physical discoveries in the farmhouse, emphasizing the unusual nature of certain objects while maintaining a factual record of law enforcement's findings. Across all reporting, there was tension between factual reporting and narrative embellishment, a balance that proved challenging in a story with inherently extraordinary details. The media coverage also contributed to a broader cultural fascination with the case. Editors and columnists debated the psychological aspects of Ed's behavior, sometimes referencing emerging studies in forensic psychology, psychiatry, and criminology. Letters to the editors, radio discussions, and public commentary reflected a mix of fear, curiosity, and moral questioning. Readers were drawn to the story not only for its strangeness, but also for its connection to broader questions about isolation, upbringing, and human behavior. For Plainfield, the media frenzy had practical implications as well. Residents became cautious about strangers in town, wary of conversations being recorded or interpreted. Daily routines were influenced by the presence of reporters, photographers, and curious outsiders. Local businesses, previously insulated from national attention, found themselves part of a story that they had not sought and could not entirely control. Law enforcement recognized the role of the press in shaping public perception. Officers provided factual statements to ensure accurate reporting, emphasizing verified details over speculation. They sought to maintain professionalism in the face of intense attention, while also managing the public's concern and curiosity. Reports of missing persons, police investigations, and the unusual discoveries in the farmhouse were carefully documented to maintain clarity and prevent misinterpretation, though the sensationalized headlines often overshadowed these efforts. As the story continued to circulate, it entered the wider consciousness as a symbol of mystery and the unexpected extremes of human behavior. The farmhouse, once a quiet home on the edge of town, became emblematic of hidden lives and private obsessions. Media coverage, while sometimes exaggerated, preserved factual details of the case, contributing to a historical record that would endure for decades. In later years, journalists, historians, and true crime writers would reference the reporting of the 1950s as both an example of sensationalism and as a source of documentation. The tension between accuracy and attention-grabbing language highlighted the challenges inherent in covering a story that was factual, yet extraordinary. For scholars and investigators, these articles provided context, timelines, and insight into both public perception and the procedural aspects of law enforcement at the time. The media frenzy, in the end, did more than just report events. It framed the story of Ed Gein for generations. Readers were introduced to a rural town disrupted by unusual behavior, a solitary man whose habits had long gone unnoticed, and the investigative processes that revealed decades of private activity. The coverage influenced cultural memory, shaped public discussion, and underscored the ways in which factual reporting and public fascination can intersect, sometimes amplifying the extraordinary aspects of events while remaining rooted in documented reality. For Plainfield, the attention gradually receded over time, though the presence of reporters and the circulation of stories left a lasting imprint. Residents reflected on both the factual details of the case and the dramatic presentation of those details in the press, understanding that their small town had become part of a story far larger than themselves. The media frenzy, therefore, was not merely a collection of headlines and articles. It represented the intersection of investigation, public curiosity, and the human tendency to be drawn to unusual circumstances. It preserved historical facts while also shaping perception, leaving a record of how one small town, a solitary man, and a series of discoveries became a national point of fascination, discussion, and study. Chapter 13, Trial and Legal Outcome. After the psychiatric evaluations and thorough documentation of the evidence from the Gein farmhouse, the case against Ed Gein proceeded toward the legal system. The judicial process that followed was shaped not only by the nature of his actions, but also by the findings of mental health professionals who had assessed his capacity to understand his behavior and the societal implications of his actions. Ed was formally charged in connection with the disappearance and death of Bernice Worden, among other investigations that emerged from the discoveries within his home. The case attracted attention from the public, the press, and legal professionals due to the unusual nature of the evidence, the history of Ed's solitary life, and the insights gained from psychiatric evaluations. From the outset, the proceedings emphasized the question of mental competency. Attorneys, judges, and psychiatric experts examined whether Ed could participate meaningfully in his defense and comprehend the charges against him. The legal team, supported by forensic psychologists, presented evidence of his long-standing mental health issues, his detachment from societal norms, and the influence of his upbringing on his understanding of right and wrong. During pre-trial hearings, Ed was evaluated multiple times to ensure that he met the requirements to stand trial. Experts observed his cognitive abilities, memory, and comprehension, determining that while he was capable of recalling events and responding to questions factually, he demonstrated limited capacity to appreciate the moral or legal significance of his actions. These evaluations were detailed and methodical, forming a crucial component of the eventual legal strategy. Ultimately, the court determined that Ed Gein was not fully competent to stand trial due to his mental state. The legal decision reflected both his psychiatric history and the assessments that documented his cognitive functioning, emotional detachment, and obsessive behaviors. Rather than proceeding through a conventional trial, the court ordered Ed to be committed to a mental health institution for treatment and supervision, rather than incarceration in a traditional correctional facility. This legal outcome was significant for several reasons. First, it recognized the role of mental health in the legal process, emphasizing the need to address both public safety and the treatment of individuals whose actions are shaped by psychological conditions. Second, it highlighted the emerging field of forensic psychology in the 1950s, where courts increasingly considered psychiatric testimony in determining competency, intent, and appropriate confinement. Third, it provided a structured framework for Ed's care, ensuring that his needs were addressed while also protecting the community. Ed's confinement was initially at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, later known as Mendota Mental Health Institute. There he was placed under continuous supervision, with routines, activities, and and treatment plans designed to monitor his behavior and maintain safety. The institution provided an environment in which his obsessive routines could continue in a controlled manner, allowing for both stability and observation by medical staff. Legal documentation from the case indicates that the court emphasized long-term institutionalization rather than punitive measures. The proceedings were grounded in the principle that Ed's mental health status significantly influenced his actions, and that traditional incarceration would not address the underlying causes of his behavior. By committing him to a mental health facility, the court acknowledged the intersection of law, psychology, and public responsibility. For the community of Plainfield, this legal outcome brought a mixture of relief and reflection. Residents understood that Ed would not return to the town, and that law enforcement and medical professionals would oversee his life in a structured environment. At the same time, the decision underscored the complexities of human behavior, the impact of isolation, and the ways in which upbringing and mental health can intersect with legal responsibility. Throughout the proceedings, the court relied heavily on the expert testimony of psychiatrists and forensic psychologists. Their reports detailed Ed's cognitive functioning, obsessive behaviors, social detachment, and long-standing maternal influence. These evaluations provided the framework for understanding his actions, supporting the legal conclusion that institutionalization was the most appropriate response. While the verdict did not involve a traditional prison sentence, it included the possibility of ongoing evaluation and adjustment. Medical staff were charged with monitoring Ed's mental state, documenting behavioral changes, and providing recommendations for care. This system reflected a dual focus on public safety and patient treatment, ensuring that Ed's confinement was both structured and responsive to his unique psychological profile. The legal outcome also influenced public perception and historical understanding of the case. Observers recognized that the combination of unusual behavior, psychiatric assessment, and legal judgment demonstrated a methodical, deliberate approach to extraordinary circumstances. For scholars, students of forensic psychology, and true crime historians, the Ed Gein case became a reference point for understanding the intersection of law, mental health, and societal norms. In the years following the commitment, Ed remained under institutional care, with ongoing assessments and treatment plans that reflected his particular needs. The court's decision ensured that he would remain in a supervised environment, balancing the dual goals of safety and understanding. For Plainfield, this resolution provided closure in practical terms, even as the extraordinary nature of the case continued to resonate in the town's memory. The proceedings, verdict, and confinement of Ed Gein highlighted several enduring lessons: the importance of psychiatric evaluation in the legal process, the recognition that mental health can shape behavior in complex ways, and the necessity of measured, factual assessment when dealing with extraordinary circumstances. Through careful documentation, expert testimony, and a legal system responsive to these factors, the court arrived at a decision that combined public protection, historical clarity, and a nuanced understanding of human behavior. Chapter 14: Life in Mendota State Hospital. Following his legal commitment, Ed Gein spent the remainder of his life under the supervision of mental health professionals at the Mendota Mental Health Institute, previously known as Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. The institution provided a structured environment designed to balance observation, care, and the maintenance of safety, both for Ed and for those around him. In Mendota, Ed's daily life became a series of routines, reflecting both his long-established habits and the structured schedules of the institution. Staff members noted that he thrived when there was predictability, meals at set times, regular periods for personal hygiene, supervised work assignments, and times allocated for recreation and rest. The familiarity of these routines seemed to provide a sense of stability, echoing the regimented patterns he had maintained for decades while living in Plainfield. Ed's activities within the hospital were varied, yet carefully monitored. He assisted with simple tasks around the institution, including maintenance work, cleaning, and organization of supplies. These activities allowed him to exercise his methodical habits in a safe, structured context. Staff observed that he performed each task with precision, attention to detail, and a deliberate pace, much like the meticulous routines that had characterized his life on the Gein farm. Medical and psychiatric care were continuous. Ed underwent regular evaluations to monitor his mental health, cognitive function, and emotional state. These assessments allowed doctors to track changes over time, provide interventions when necessary, and maintain detailed records of his condition. Observations indicated that he remained socially detached, with limited capacity for interpersonal engagement, yet cognitively coherent and capable of following instructions and adapting to structured expectations. Therapeutic interventions focused on stability and observation, rather than attempting to fundamentally alter his long-standing behavioral patterns. Staff noted that Ed responded best to consistent routines, predictable schedules, and clear guidance. Sudden changes or disruptions were generally met with confusion or withdrawal, underscoring the importance of maintaining an environment that mirrored the structured life he had established in isolation. Interactions with staff were characterized by formality and calm. Ed did not engage in lengthy conversations, but he responded politely when addressed, often answering questions factually and without embellishment. He demonstrated compliance with institutional rules, maintaining a quiet presence in communal spaces, and rarely exhibiting any behavior that was disruptive or unpredictable. During his later years, Ed's life at Mendota was punctuated by periodic medical care. He received attention for routine health concerns, age-related conditions, and ongoing psychiatric support. Doctors noted that he required minimal medication for agitation or emotional disturbance, largely because the structured environment itself minimized stresses and allowed him to maintain habits that had long provided him with personal stability. Recreational time, though limited, was observed to have a positive effect on his demeanor. Simple activities such as reading, walking on hospital grounds, or engaging in supervised tasks allowed Ed to occupy his time in a manner consistent with his solitary tendencies, yet under professional oversight. Staff carefully monitored these activities, ensuring both safety and the preservation of routine. Throughout his institutional life, Ed remained largely detached from broader social engagement. He did not form friendships in the conventional sense, nor did he participate in social groups beyond what was required for institutional functioning. His solitary habits persisted, now transferred from the isolation of a farmhouse to the structured containment of a hospital environment. Yet the staff observed that this detachment was consistent with the behavioral patterns documented over decades, providing continuity rather than disruption. The hospital environment also allowed for historical and clinical documentation. Psychiatrists, nurses, and administrators maintained meticulous records of Ed's behavior, responses to interventions, and adherence to routines. These records provided insight into his long-term mental state, the effects of structured living, and the ongoing management of individuals with unusual psychological and behavioral histories. Over time, Ed's condition remained relatively stable. He adapted to institutional life, continuing to perform tasks with methodical care, adhering to schedules, and participating minimally in supervised activities. Staff noted that while he remained socially and emotionally detached, he exhibited no signs of escalating disturbance or aggression. His days passed in quiet routine, echoing the rhythms of his earlier life on the farm, yet now shaped by the oversight and structure of the institution. The residents of Plainfield, by contrast, gradually turned their attention elsewhere. Though the memory of Ed Gein remained embedded in local history, his confinement at Mendota ensured both public safety and the continuation of professional study, allowing experts to observe long-term patterns of behavior and mental health management in cases of extreme isolation and compulsive habits. Medical care and psychiatric observation continued up to his death in 1984. Ed Gein's life at Mendota demonstrated the capacity of structured institutional environments to provide both containment and stability for individuals whose behaviors had previously caused significant disruption. The combination of observation, routine, and professional oversight maintained a controlled environment in which Ed could exist safely without posing risk to the community, while also allowing for ongoing study of his unique psychological and behavioral patterns. In this way, Mendota became the setting for the final chapter of Ed Gein's life. A man who had once lived in extreme isolation on a Wisconsin farm now lived under constant supervision in a carefully managed routine, subject to professional oversight and historical documentation. His story, both in the town of Plainfield and within the institution, became an enduring case study in mental health, isolation, obsessive behavior, and the intersection of psychology and the legal system. Chapter 15: Cultural Echoes. Even as Ed Gein lived out his later years under institutional care at Mendota State Hospital, the story of his life, discoveries, and investigation began to resonate far beyond the town of Plainfield. Authors, filmmakers, and cultural observers found in his story a source of both fascination and creative inspiration. Over time, elements of his life and the objects discovered in his farmhouse became influential in literature and cinema, shaping popular culture while remaining rooted in the historical facts of the case. One of the earliest and most direct influences was observed in the realm of literature. Writers who explored psychological tension, human isolation, and unusual behavior drew inspiration from Ed's story, often integrating elements of his life into fictionalized characters. The solitary farmhouse, meticulous routines, and unusual objects he collected provided narrative material that could be adapted for suspense and psychological exploration. In these works, aspects of Ed's life were reshaped into storylines that emphasized character study, societal tension, and the interplay between isolation and behavior. Perhaps the most well-known literary influence came through Robert Bloch, whose 1959 novel Psycho featured a character inspired by Ed Gein. Bloch incorporated the themes of maternal influence, isolation, and obsession into the character of Norman Bates. While the novel took creative liberties, the fundamental inspiration came from Ed's real-life experiences and the environment in which he had lived. The novel explored psychological complexity, moral ambiguity, and the ways in which upbringing and environment could shape an individual's actions, themes that were directly informed by Ed's life story. In the world of cinema, Ed's influence became even more pronounced. Filmmakers drew upon the documented details of his life and the eerie, solitary atmosphere of his farmhouse to craft stories that combined suspense, psychological tension, and societal fascination with unusual behavior. Notably, the 1960 film adaptation of Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, translated the themes of the novel to the screen, presenting audiences with a character whose life and actions echoed the patterns observed in Plainfield, while remaining fictionalized for narrative purposes. Later films, such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Silence of the Lambs, similarly drew inspiration from Ed Gein's life, albeit in varying degrees. Elements of character behavior, the creation of unusual objects, and the themes of isolation and obsession were adapted into fictional settings and storylines. Directors and screenwriters emphasized psychological complexity, the interplay of environment and behavior, and the tension between public normality and private deviation, all themes that had been observed in Ed's life and the investigation that followed. While these cultural works were fictionalized, historians and cultural scholars note that they maintained a connection to reality through foundational details. The depiction of solitary living, meticulous routines, and unusual object creation in these films and novels reflected the historical record of Ed Gein's life. In this sense, popular culture translated real-life events into narrative explorations of human psychology, behavior, and societal response, while also preserving the essence of the factual story. The influence of Ed's story extended beyond specific characters or plot points. Themes of isolation, obsessive behavior, and the long-term effects of upbringing became common elements in both literature and film inspired by his life. Writers and directors explored questions of morality, personal compulsion, and the interplay between environment and action, often framing these inquiries within suspenseful or psychological narratives that resonated with audiences. For the general public, these cultural echoes served to cement Ed Gein's story in collective memory. Readers, viewers, and scholars encountered fictionalized versions of events, yet they were indirectly engaging with the real history of Plainfield, the farmhouse, and the meticulous habits of its solitary occupant. The adaptations allowed the story to travel beyond Wisconsin, reaching audiences across the United States and internationally, contributing to a broader fascination with unusual psychological and behavioral cases. At the same time, these works prompted reflection on societal understanding of mental health and human behavior. By translating factual events into narrative form, authors and filmmakers encouraged audiences to consider how isolation, upbringing, and psychological patterns could intersect in extreme ways. While dramatized for artistic purposes, the underlying questions were rooted in Ed Gein's life, the investigation, and the psychiatric evaluations that had informed legal proceedings. Even decades after the initial events, the story of Ed Gein continues to influence writers, filmmakers, and cultural commentators. Academic studies, psychological texts, and true crime retrospectives examine the ways in which his life informed both artistic expression and scholarly analysis. The cultural legacy of Plainfield, the farmhouse, and Ed's behavior demonstrates the enduring intersection of historical events, media interpretation, and creative adaptation. Importantly, the story's influence is not merely sensational. Scholars and journalists have emphasized factual accuracy when documenting Ed's life, while creative works have often used fictionalization to explore broader themes of psychology, morality, and societal reaction. This balance allows Ed's story to serve both as a historical case study and as a foundation for cultural reflection, providing insight into the ways in which unusual human behavior can captivate public attention and inspire artistic exploration. In this way, Ed Gein's life extended far beyond the boundaries of Plainfield. Through literature, film, and cultural analysis, his story became a lens through which questions of isolation, obsession, and human behavior could be examined. From the quiet farmhouse to national headlines, and from psychiatric evaluations to fictional adaptations, the echoes of his life continue to shape understanding, creativity, and the study of psychological and behavioral history. Chapter 16. Plainfield Afterward. In the years following Ed Gein's arrest, confession, and institutionalization, the town of Plainfield slowly returned to its rhythms, yet the events of the 1950s left a lasting imprint on both the landscape and the collective memory of its residents. For a small rural community, the sudden exposure to a story of such unusual behavior had been disorienting, unsettling, and in some ways transformative. The process of recovery and reflection unfolded gradually, shaped by the passage of time, the distancing of Ed from the town, and the broader understanding of his life and circumstances. Residents often spoke quietly about the past, recognizing that the story of Ed Gein was intertwined with decades of local life. Many remembered him as a solitary figure long before the farmhouse discoveries, a man whose habits were eccentric but largely unobtrusive. Memories of interactions at the general store, the odd jobs he performed, and his quiet presence in the community formed a complex picture, one of ordinary routines layered with extraordinary revelation. Community healing involved both practical and emotional elements. On a practical level, life continued in the town as it always had. Farms were tended, businesses operated, schools functioned, and neighbors maintained connections with one another. The physical spaces associated with Ed's life, the farmhouse, the surrounding land, and nearby structures, were eventually sold, demolished, or repurposed, creating distance between the memory of the events and the ongoing daily life of Plainfield. These changes allowed residents to reclaim familiar spaces without the constant, tangible reminder of past discoveries. Emotionally, the town's residents processed a mix of feelings. There was relief that the legal system had addressed the situation, reassurance that Ed was confined under professional supervision, and a gradual acceptance of the unusual circumstances that had existed in their midst for decades. At the same time, there was reflection on the fragility of social assumptions, that a quiet neighbor could live in isolation while maintaining habits entirely hidden from observation. These reflections prompted conversations about community vigilance, social bonds, and the ways in which small-town life can sometimes obscure the realities of individual experience. Over time, local historians, journalists, and community members documented the events with care. Oral histories captured first-hand memories of Ed, the police investigation, and the broader social climate of 1950s Plainfield. These accounts emphasized both factual details and personal reflection, balancing the extraordinary nature of the discoveries with the ordinary, everyday life of the town before, during, and after the events. By preserving these narratives, the community contributed to a historical record that allowed future generations to understand the context, response, and impact of the case without resorting to sensationalism. Community memory also included a focus on neighborhood resilience and interpersonal relationships. Residents reflected on how the events had highlighted both the vulnerability and strength of a small town. Neighbors recalled supporting one another through media attention, participating in local discussions about safety and vigilance, and maintaining routines that preserved normalcy. These shared experiences fostered a sense of collective recovery, emphasizing the importance of community cohesion in the aftermath of extraordinary circumstances. In addition, Plainfield gradually became a point of interest for outside observers, historians, and writers. While some attention returned to the story of Ed Gein through books, documentaries, and academic studies, residents largely approached this with pragmatism. They acknowledged the historical significance of the events while maintaining the integrity of their everyday lives. The town itself, its schools, businesses, and farmland continued to function as a community rooted in routine rather than spectacle. Local reflection also touched on the broader social and psychological lessons of the events. Residents recognized that isolation, secrecy, and unconventional upbringing had played a central role in shaping Ed's life. Conversations often emphasized empathy for the complexities of human behavior, alongside recognition of the importance of social support, mental health awareness, and community engagement. These reflections became part of the narrative passed from one generation to the next, shaping how residents contextualized both the extraordinary and the ordinary aspects of the town's history. Over decades, Plainfield developed a nuanced memory of Ed Gein. On one hand, he was remembered as the solitary figure whose life had hidden unusual and historically significant behaviors. On the other, the town preserved the story of community resilience, practical recovery, and reflection on human psychology. Local historians, school curricula, and oral histories emphasized factual accuracy, careful description, and contextual understanding, ensuring that the story was not reduced to sensationalism, but retained as a meaningful case study of rural life, isolation, and human complexity. By the late 20th century, the events of the 1950s had become part of the broader identity of Plainfield, though not its defining feature. Residents often noted that the town's history included ordinary life, seasonal rhythms, community connections, and the quiet unfolding of daily work alongside the extraordinary story of Ed Gein. The memory of the events persisted as both a historical record and a point of reflection, illustrating how a small town could absorb, respond to, and ultimately move forward from unusual and historically significant occurrences. In this way, Plainfield, after Ed Gein's institutionalization, demonstrated the resilience of community, the importance of factual memory, and the capacity of ordinary life to continue alongside extraordinary historical events. The town retained its rhythms, preserved its stories, and reflected carefully on a chapter of its past that, while unusual, became part of the collective understanding of both human behavior and small-town experience. Chapter 17. The Auction and Legacy. After Ed Gein's institutionalization, the farmhouse and surrounding property in Plainfield remained unoccupied, a quiet reminder of the events that had unfolded there. Over time, the property became the focus of legal and administrative decisions regarding its disposition, as authorities and family representatives determined the appropriate course of action for both the land and the items found within it. The farmhouse itself, the building in which Ed had spent decades in isolation, was eventually sold and demolished. Local authorities, recognizing the strong public interest in the property and the disturbing nature of some of its contents, opted for demolition as a way to ensure public safety and remove a physical reminder of the unusual events. The land was repurposed for more conventional uses, allowing the area to return to a quieter, functional state while distancing the communities from the symbolic weight of the farm. The contents of the house presented a complex challenge. Many of the objects discovered by law enforcement, which had attracted national attention due to their unusual and historically significant nature, were removed and catalogued carefully. Some items were retained for official records, serving as evidence and as material for historical and legal study. Others were destroyed to prevent inappropriate display or public fascination, reflecting a sensitivity to both public perception and ethical considerations surrounding human remains and personal artifacts. At one point, portions of the farm and certain non-human items were offered at auction. These sales were conducted under strict oversight, often with restrictions to ensure that objects with potential historical or forensic significance were preserved for official documentation, rather than private curiosity. Auctioned items included furniture, tools, and household objects that had been in the farmhouse prior to the discoveries, alongside standard farm equipment unrelated to the unusual findings. The sale of these items allowed for practical resolution of the property, while maintaining attention to safety, historical record, and respect for local memory. The auction and subsequent dispersal of Ed Gein's possessions had a lasting effect on the perception of his legacy. For the community, it represented the final physical separation from the farmhouse and its contents, enabling residents to reclaim familiar spaces and continue daily life without constant reminders. For historians and scholars, the careful documentation and cataloguing of items ensured that the story remained accessible for research, educational purposes, and historical understanding. In the years following the auction, the legacy of Ed Gein extended beyond physical possessions to encompass broader cultural and historical reflection. Scholars examined the intersection of upbringing, isolation, mental health, and behavior, using both documented artifacts and historical records to provide insight into the unusual circumstances of his life. By maintaining factual records and separating sensationalized narratives from verified evidence, researchers were able to create a clear historical account that informed understanding of both Ed Gein and the town of Plainfield. The dispersal of objects also influenced public perception and popular culture. By removing the farmhouse and auctioning or documenting items, authorities limited the potential for voyeuristic fascination while preserving the material history for legitimate study. This balance allowed the community, scholars, and the wider public to engage with the story responsibly, focusing on factual understanding rather than sensationalism or spectacle. Ed Gein's legacy, therefore, became both tangible and conceptual. Tangibly, it was preserved in legal records, photographs, and catalogued objects. Conceptually, it endured through cultural works, scholarly study, and the ongoing reflection on the psychological, social, and historical aspects of his life. The auction and careful handling of the farm and possessions ensured that the story remained part of the historical record, while mitigating the potential for undue exploitation or sensationalism. For Plainfield, the resolution of the property allowed the town to move forward while preserving memory. Residents could reflect on the events, discuss their historical significance, and incorporate lessons about human behavior, mental health, and community awareness into local understanding. The auction and legacy of Ed Gein's property became a final chapter in the physical story, while the historical and cultural influence continued to unfold in writing, research, and popular media. In broader terms, Ed Gein's story, his life, his routines, and the subsequent handling of his property offered a cautionary tale about isolation, upbringing, and the complexities of human behavior. The careful management of the farmhouse, the cataloguing and disposition of possessions, and the documentation of events ensured that the narrative could be studied, understood, and remembered accurately. The auction marked both an ending and a transition, the end of the physical presence of the farm and the beginning of the legacy, preserved in historical records, cultural echoes, and public consciousness. Through these measures, the events of Plainfield and the story of Ed Gein were transformed from a local disturbance into a documented historical case, offering insight, reflection, and understanding for communities, scholars, and audiences far beyond rural Wisconsin. The farmhouse, once the center of decades of isolation, was gone, but the lessons, reflections, and historical record remained, providing a foundation for continued study and understanding of a life shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Chapter 18: Reflections on Isolation and Mental Health. The story of Ed Gein provides more than a record of unusual behavior and legal proceedings. It offers insight into the profound effects of isolation, neglect, and early trauma on the human mind. Observers, scholars, and mental health professionals have long reflected on how the environment in which a person grows up, coupled with the experiences of solitude and loss, can shape cognition, emotion, and behavior in lasting ways. From birth, Ed's life was shaped by an intense and controlling household. The influence of his mother, Augusta, who imposed a strict moral code and instilled deep fears about sin, shaped Ed's understanding of the world, morality, and relationships. These lessons were not tempered by social interaction or diverse experience. Instead, they became internalized rules that governed thought and behavior throughout his life. Psychologists note that early life experiences, particularly those involving fear, control, or limited emotional support, can have enduring effects on personality, coping mechanisms, and emotional regulation. Isolation played a particularly significant role in Ed's development. Following the deaths of his father and brother, and later the death of his mother, Ed lived alone for years on the family farm. During this time, he had little contact with the outside world, maintaining only occasional interactions at local stores or through small jobs in town. This prolonged solitude reinforced obsessive routines, reinforced behavioral patterns, and limited the opportunity for social learning. Modern psychological studies suggest that extended social isolation can impair empathy, distort social norms, and intensify compulsive or ritualized behaviors, all of which were observed in Ed's life. The intersection of trauma and isolation is also evident in the case. Beyond maternal control, the losses of family members contributed to cumulative emotional stress, leaving Ed with a profound sense of solitude and an absence of conventional emotional support. This combination of fear-based upbringing and early bereavement created conditions in which unusual coping mechanisms could develop, manifesting in ways that diverged sharply from societal expectations. Psychiatric evaluations and historical analysis of Ed's life suggest that his behaviors, while extreme, can be contextualized as adaptive responses to an environment marked by control, trauma, and social withdrawal. The collection and organization of objects, meticulous routines, and structured habits functioned as methods of control and stability, providing predictability in a world that had offered little emotional consistency. These behaviors, though historically extraordinary, illustrate how the mind seeks order and familiarity in the absence of supportive social and emotional frameworks. From a broader perspective, Ed Gein's story highlights the importance of early intervention, mental health support, and community engagement. Modern mental health practice recognizes that prolonged neglect, social isolation, and exposure to fear-based upbringing can increase vulnerability to obsessive or maladaptive behaviors. Early identification of risk factors, supportive social networks, and accessible mental health care can mitigate the development of extreme behaviors and provide individuals with tools to navigate challenges safely. In addition, the case underscores the role of environment in shaping behavior. Rural isolation, limited social contact, and a lack of meaningful external relationships contributed to a psychological landscape in which obsessive behaviors could flourish unchecked. Observers and mental health professionals often note that context matters as much as individual predisposition. Patterns that may seem extraordinary in one environment can be seen as adaptive or coping mechanisms within another, when survival, routine, and control are prioritized in the absence of broader social interaction. For communities, the story offers a reminder of vigilance, empathy, and understanding. It illustrates how subtle signs of distress, withdrawal, or obsession may go unnoticed when they occur in isolation, and how social networks, observation, and engagement can provide both preventive insight and supportive intervention. While Ed's life represents an extreme example, the principles are applicable to broader discussions of mental health, child development, and community care. Reflection on Ed's case also emphasizes the limits of moral judgment when divorced from context. While his actions were historically extraordinary, understanding the contributing factors, maternal control, isolation, trauma, and prolonged solitude, offers a framework for analysis that prioritizes insight over sensationalism. Scholars and mental health professionals use such cases to illustrate the importance of contextualizing behavior, rather than reducing it to simple categories of good or bad. Finally, the story of Ed Gein encourages consideration of how society addresses mental health in both preventive and reactive ways. Access to support, community engagement, and early attention to trauma can profoundly alter life trajectories. While Ed's story reflects a convergence of unusual circumstances, it also serves as a cautionary illustration of what can happen when isolation, neglect, and lack of intervention combine over decades. In reflecting on Ed Gein's life, scholars, residents, and students of human behavior are reminded that understanding the mind requires patience, context, and careful observation. Solitude, trauma, and the absence of supportive relationships can shape behavior in ways that are extreme, but also understandable when examined through the lens of psychology. The lessons from Plainfield and Mendota extend beyond one individual, offering insight into human resilience, vulnerability, and the crucial role of connection, care, and early support in shaping lives. Chapter 19: How True Crime Changes Us. The story of Ed Gein, his life in Plainfield, and the extraordinary events surrounding his arrest and institutionalization occupy a unique place in cultural and historical memory. Beyond the specific details of the case, there is a broader question that emerges for communities, scholars, and audiences alike. Why are we drawn to true crime? What is it about stories like Ed Gein's that captures attention, prompts reflection, and endures in collective consciousness for decades? True crime, at its core, offers a lens through which people can explore human behavior, morality, and the boundaries of societal norms. Cases such as Ed Gein's provide a framework for examining questions that are both universal and deeply personal. How do upbringing, isolation, and trauma shape a person's actions? How does society respond to unusual or extreme behaviors? What systems exist to intervene when individuals exist on the margins of conventional life? By engaging with these questions, audiences are invited to consider both the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the broader principles of human psychology, social responsibility, and ethics. One aspect of the fascination lies in the intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary behavior. Ed Gein, in many ways, was a familiar figure within his community, a quiet man performing odd jobs, interacting occasionally with neighbors. Yet beneath this ordinary exterior existed a life marked by isolation, obsessive routines, and behaviors that were historically significant and unusual. True crime highlights this tension, offering a way for audiences to grapple with the complexities of human behavior and to recognize that appearances can sometimes mask profound psychological patterns. Another dimension of engagement comes from the opportunities for empathy over judgment. While sensationalized accounts can emphasize shock or horror, a careful, factual exploration, such as the story told in this sleep story series, encourages understanding of context, history, and mental health. Audiences are prompted to reflect not only on the events themselves, but also on the factors that shaped them: maternal influence, loss, prolonged solitude, and the absence of meaningful social support. In this way, true crime can foster a form of empathetic curiosity, guiding listeners to consider how societal structures, early intervention, and community care influence individual behavior. True crime also functions as a form of historical documentation. In the case of Ed Gein, the meticulous recording of events by law enforcement, psychiatrists, journalists, and historians provides insight into the social, legal, and psychological landscape of mid-20th century rural America. By engaging with these records, audiences gain more than a story. They gain an understanding of investigative practices, forensic assessment, psychiatric evaluation, and the ways in which communities responded to unexpected circumstances. This historical perspective allows true crime to educate as well as intrigue, grounding fascination in factual observation and careful analysis. Society's fascination is also shaped by the enduring cultural echoes of cases like Ed Gein's. Literature, film, and media draw upon his story not to glorify actions, but to explore themes of isolation, obsession, morality, and human complexity. Through these adaptations, audiences encounter fictionalized narratives that provoke reflection on character, motivation, and societal response, without losing sight of the real-life context. The balance of factual influence and creative interpretation allows true crime to remain both compelling and instructive, bridging the gap between historical events and cultural engagement. Moreover, true crime encourages self-reflection and societal awareness. Listening to, reading about, or analyzing cases such as Ed Gein's prompts consideration of one's own assumptions, moral reasoning, and understanding of human behavior. Questions arise naturally. What warning signs might have existed, and how could intervention have occurred? How do community structures support or fail individuals who are isolated or at risk? These reflections move the listener from passive observation to thoughtful consideration, highlighting the broader lessons embedded within historical events. Finally, true crime reminds us of the complexity of human experience. Ed Gein's life cannot be reduced to simple labels or categories. It is a narrative of isolation, obsessive habits, trauma, and mental health challenges, intertwined with societal response, investigation, and cultural interpretation. Engaging with the story allows audiences to appreciate nuance, recognize the importance of context, and understand that human behavior exists on a spectrum shaped by biology, psychology, environment, and circumstance. In this sense, true crime is not merely a fascination with wrongdoing. It is a study of human nature, society, and the structures that shape lives. By approaching stories with careful attention to fact, reflection, and empathy, audiences can encounter narratives like Ed Gein's with both curiosity and understanding. Listeners are invited to engage thoughtfully with history, to consider the interplay of isolation, upbringing, and behavior, and to recognize the value of compassion, mental health support, and societal awareness. The enduring power of true crime lies not in fear or shock alone, but in the lessons it provides. The importance of observation, care, and intervention, the recognition of psychological complexity, and the opportunity to reflect on human behavior in ways that are both sobering and instructive. In the story of Ed Gein, we find a unique intersection of history, psychology, and society, one that continues to resonate, teach, and prompt reflection for those who encounter it carefully, thoughtfully, and with a measured curiosity that values understanding over judgment. Through listening to these stories, examining the facts, and reflecting on the social, psychological, and historical dimensions, audiences are reminded that true crime can be a vehicle for learning, empathy, and insight. It allows society to confront the extraordinary, understand the ordinary, and recognize that even the most unusual human behaviors are shaped by a combination of environment, upbringing, and circumstance. The fascination persists because these stories illuminate the human condition, offering both caution and understanding, reflection and insight, long after the immediate events have passed. I hope you found tonight's sleep story, exploring the entire story of Ed Gein, from his early life in Plainfield, through the discoveries, investigations, and his years in institutional care, to the lasting cultural echoes and lessons about isolation and mental health, both informative and thought-provoking. If you're still awake, there's no need to worry. Just let your mind rest and drift. And if you'd like, you might consider putting on another one of our videos to continue your journey into history, psychology, and the stories that shape our world. You can find plenty more calming histories and sleep stories right here on the channel. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you a peaceful night's rest wherever you are in the world.